Are we missing one? Okay.
No, just 3 of the first.
Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Committee is meeting today to examine the lessons learned from last year's disasters, including the preparedness, response, and recovery efforts for Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria, in order to better prepare for future disasters. This is also Administrator Long's first appearance before the Homeland Security Committee. Welcome, sir. And I welcome the opportunity to learn more about your priorities and vision for the future of FEMA. I also see that we have members joining us today that are not on the committee. I ask unanimous consent that Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon, Congresswoman Velasquez, and Delegate Stacy Plaskett be allowed to sit at the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. This morning, our committee has gathered to review our ability to prepare, respond, and rebuild in the wake of the natural disasters of 2017. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my heartfelt condolences to the victims of the recent bombings in my hometown of Austin. These heinous attacks need to stop. No one should ever be afraid to open up their front door and pick up a package. We will also find who's responsible for these murders and make sure they are brought to justice. While the American people are constant targets of foreign and domestic terrorists, cyber criminal gangs like MS-13, and human trafficking, today's hearing will focus on the dangers of natural disasters. In 2017, there were 65 major disasters declared. They included hurricanes that hit my home state of Texas, Florida, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. We also saw dozens of wildfires burn through thousands of acres and destroy everything in their path. After Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, I personally toured the devastated communities in my district, as well as the city of Houston. Days of punishing rain, rising rivers, and overflowing bayous wreaked havoc on much of my state. This destruction was horrifying. Roads were flooded. Many homes were obliterated. And sadly, many people lost their lives. But as I witnessed the strength of the Texas spirit, that was the positive. And many volunteers hopped into their boats to rescue people who were stranded on the rooftops or trapped in a vehicle. Others waded out into the murky waters filled with snakes and fire ants to save their loved ones or even to help a stranger. Texans helping Texans rose to the challenge and assisted one another during a very tough time. Strong coordination at the local, state, and federal level with FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers played a key role as well, and I commend the efforts of the response efforts in Hurricane Harvey. This kind of teamwork was also evident in Florida after Hurricane Irma. Unfortunately, Hurricane Maria completely shattered Puerto Rico, and even today, much of the island is still struggling to recover. It's important that we learn from the lessons of each of these storms so we're better prepared for the future. Natural disasters bring a lot of harm, but they also provide an opportunity to put our differences aside and work together. I'm proud to say that both parties came together to pass a supplemental relief package that provided billions of dollars to the Disaster Relief Fund and the National Flood Insurance Program. It's always our goal to make sure FEMA has the resources and capabilities it needs before it's called into action. The first ever comprehensive reauthorization of DHS that passed the House in July will strengthen our first responders and frontline defenders. I'm encouraged that the Senate has finally taken action on this reauthorization bill, and I hope to have that passed soon and sent to the President. I'd also like to personally thank each of today's witnesses for being with us here this morning. Shortly after Hurricane Harvey, I met with Administrator Long at FEMA's headquarters to receive a briefing during the initial recovery. While there, I could see firsthand the dedication and professionalism of the men and women who sprung into action during that time of crisis. I'm grateful for their service and for their efforts and all of our partners at the federal, state, and local level. And with that, I yield back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To begin today, I'd also like to express my condolences to the families of the victims of the recent Austin package bombings. My thoughts and prayers are with those who lost their lives as well as the survivors. Turning to today's hearing, as you know, Mr. Chairman, we were originally scheduled to have FEMA Administrator Brock Long before this committee in November of last year. Unfortunately, you abruptly canceled the hearing after the Democrats invited the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, to testify about the effects of Hurricane Maria on her community. That troubling turn of events occurred shortly after Administrator Long publicly stated that he had filtered out the mayor a long time ago. I'm not sure when it becomes acceptable to be dismissive of an official representing an American city devastated by a natural disaster. Next week marks 6 months since Hurricane Maria made landfall on Puerto Rico, sending the island into darkness and changing life for nearly 3.3 million Americans. Still today, thousands of Puerto Ricans, or 10% of the population, have yet to have power restored. The Puerto Rican economy continues to struggle as a result of the devastation to infrastructure, homes, and businesses. Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans have moved to the mainland in the wake of the storm, perhaps never to return. So while I'm pleased the committee is finally holding this important hearing, to say it is long overdue would be an understatement. The 2017 Atlantic hurricane season was among the most active on record, with 17 named storms. 3 major storms caused devastation in Texas, Florida, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. The response to those storms by the Trump administration was a study in contrast. After Harvey, President Trump tweeted, "Texas, we're with you today, we're with you tomorrow, and we will be with you every single day after to restore, recover, and rebuild." President Trump later visited the affected area just 4 days later. This is what Americans expect from the president and their federal government in the wake of disaster. Similarly, after Hurricane Irma struck Florida, President Trump tweeted, "Just like Texas, we are with you today, we're with you tomorrow, and we will be with you every single day after to restore, recover, and rebuild." Again, the president visited 4 days later, as it should be. But after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and parts of the U.S. Virgin Islands, President Trump's words and actions were decidedly different. He tweeted, "We cannot keep FEMA, the military, and the first responders who have been amazing under the most difficult circumstances in Puerto Rico forever." The president also said the government of Puerto Rico wanted everything to be done for them and accused officials of poor leadership. And when we finally showed up in Puerto Rico 2 weeks after the storm made landfall, he chunked rolls of paper towels at survivors. President Trump did not even bother to visit the U.S. Virgin Islands. For an American president to behave in such a way is beyond the pale. In keeping with the president's action, the federal government's response was decidedly different after each storm. FEMA had supplies and personnel pre-positioned before Hurricane Harvey made landfall on August 25th, and shortly thereafter, the federal government had more than 31,000 of federal employees on the ground in support of the response. FEMA also provided 3 million meals and 3 million liters of water for Harvey survivors. Likewise, for Irma, there were more than 40,000 federal personnel, including 2,600 FEMA staff, on the ground just before the storm struck on September 10th. FEMA also provided 6.6 million meals and 4.7 million liters of water to the region in the days just after Irma made landfall. The Trump administration's response to Maria was far slower and smaller. Even weeks after the storm, there were only a fraction of the federal personnel on the ground in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as has been deployed to Texas and Florida. Food and water were in short supply. The federal contracts to provide essentials like tarps and meals were botched, further slowing the response. Electrical outages to critical facilities like hospitals required doctors in Puerto Rico to perform life-saving surgery using the light of their cell phones. Doctors in the U.S. Virgin Islands saw the only hospital on St. Thomas badly damaged, rendering its medical floor and cancer treatment facility unusable. Despite the devastation, it took 43 days for President Trump to approve public assistance program disaster aid to Puerto Rico, quadruple the amount of time it took to approve such assistance to Texas and Florida. I understand the delay was due to the Trump's administration imposing conditions on this aid never before required of any community, a deal some have called the Puerto Rico Special. Meanwhile, the president found the time to spend several days at his Trump properties golfing, holding multiple fundraisers, fighting with NFL players about taking a knee during a game, and tweet about everything from fake news to the Russian hoax. That is not the kind of leadership the people of Puerto Rico or any American affected by disasters expect or deserve. Today I hope to hear from our first panel of witnesses about how the federal government is using funding approved by Congress to support response and recovery in communities hit by hurricanes, wildfires, and other recent disasters. I'm particularly interested in hearing from Administrator Long about the lessons learned from these disasters and how FEMA can be better prepared to respond in the future. For the witnesses on our second panel, I hope to hear your perspective on the federal response and what we can do to support your recovery going forward. FEMA's mission is supposed to be helping people before, during, and after disasters. It's our job to conduct the oversight necessary to ensure the agency fulfills that mission. So I look forward to our discussion today. Mr. Chairman, you recognize two members who are here, Ms. Plaskett and Ms. Velasquez, and I asked unanimous consent that they be allowed to give that statement at this time.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered. And just for the record, for the members, the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, was invited to attend this hearing, and unfortunately, she could not make it today.
Well, she's actually in the hospital.
Yeah, and that's why I said unfortunately.
Yeah.
We're pleased to have two distinguished panels of witnesses before us today on this important topic. Our first includes the Honorable Brock Long, Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Next, we have Major General Donald Jackson, Deputy Commanding General of the Civil and Emergency Operations at the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And finally, Mr. John Kelly, not the Chief of Staff, but rather the Acting Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The witnesses' full written statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes Administrator Long for his opening statement. Yes, sir.
Chairman Mccaul, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to be here before you in the spirit of improvement. I'm here to talk about FEMA's Herculean, I believe Herculean efforts to put forward response and recovery efforts to help millions of Americans, and there's always room for improvement. I'm the agency's worst critic, by all means. I've been in this job 9 months, and I realize that we have a long way to go, not just as FEMA, but as a whole community. Disaster response and recovery the proper way has to be federally supported, state managed, and locally executed, and that's the model that we've got to put forward. I hope today to unveil a new strategic plan right here in this committee, not only to you, but to the public today, and I know that we have a slide that I'd like to display, if possible, that I'll break down here in a minute. To put this season into context by numbers is nearly impossible. The numbers are huge. What we went through, if you look at just Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the California wildfires, each one of these events could have been catastrophic in their own right, much less happening weeks, in rapid succession. We estimate that roughly 47 million people were impacted by these events. That's 16% of the United States population. 47 million people were forced to act, to take a protective action, whether they were asked to shelter in place, evacuate, or whether they lost their home. It's a tremendous effort to help that amount of people in this country, and we've got a long way to go to improve. On the response side, the federal government's efforts to coordinate search and rescue teams can be credited with saving 9,000 lives. There were thousands and thousands more saved at the local level by first responders and state responders and neighbor helping neighbor. On the recovery side, just to put this into context, we registered 4.7 million people into our individual assistance processes to help kickstart recovery. I can't make people whole, but what we can do is put forward assistance to help kickstart their recovery. That number is more than Hurricane Katrina, Sandy, Wilma, and Rita combined, and packed into 3, 4, 5 months in that time period. Today, we still get 13,000 calls a day for assistance that this agency is trying to work through and process. We learned a lot of lessons. We learned that we got to work with our private sector partners to build redundant and resilient communications backbones so that we don't lose communications and the ability to communicate with one another, not only as responders, but to our citizens during the response. We got to streamline a federal government fragmented recovery process. Aid comes down from 17 different agencies. It's confusing. Governors and mayors don't know what they're entitled to and how to use it for the greatest good. I'm willing to take the approach to help Congress formulate a more streamlined approach. We also have to fix housing. I'm going to ask you for support to help me fix housing and give more granting authorities to governors going forward, to give governors, to put them in this, to give them more control to understand how to help their communities recover from housing missions and not just have it solely on FEMA's shoulders. There's nothing more important than the trained emergency manager. We've implemented 4,700 roughly local hires. We've hired roughly 1,300 of the best and brightest Puerto Ricans to help us go through the response and recovery. Technically, I might be one of the largest employers over the next couple months within the Commonwealth. And we're training them to be emergency managers. We're creating a backbone of emergency management that did not exist before the storm, not only for the Commonwealth, but for the 78 municipalities. The same thing is being done for the Virgin Islands and other states as well. We have to invest more in pre-disaster mitigation to reduce the impacts of what we just saw. We've got to put more money up front rather than on the back end. It makes no sense the way we do that in this country. We have to simplify processes. I've had numerous conversations with many of you about things that get in the way. This agency had to perform 2.3 million home inspections. Put your mind around that for a minute. It takes a lot of people to perform that many. It's a slow, cumbersome process that slows recovery down. I'm asking to do away with the majority of the inspection process and use technology and trust the disaster survivor rather than set up risk-adverse systems to protect solely for fraud that draws the system out. Going forward, the strategic plan, we asked our constituents and I asked specifically, what do you want FEMA to be good at? Where do you want us to be? What do we need to do? How do we need to get there? We reached out to our state and local partners. We reached out to non-governmental organizations, and we got 2,300 comments back. As a result, we did a trend analysis, and we've developed 3 major goals that my agency is going to strive for going forward. We're asking other agencies involved at the state and local levels to also embrace this as a unified approach. We have to have a unified approach going forward in disaster response and recovery. The 3 goals are, 1, we don't have a true culture of preparedness in this country. Our citizens are not prepared. We have to realistically design approaches to get them to be financially ready. We have to get them to be, we've got to teach them tangible skills like CPR again and go back to the old civil defense days of being ready. We also have to do more pre-disaster mitigation. We have to close the insurance gap. Far too many people are uninsured or underinsured, and that's not right. Those who are insured will recover a lot quicker than those that are not. Help me overcome this problem. The second goal is ready the nation for catastrophic disasters. We're not ready for the low to no notice big events like the New Madrid earthquakes or nation-state threat. We have a lot of work to do. I'm asking for help. What I'm going to be asking for is we have to have commodity contracts, for example, the ability to do water, food, and MREs or hygiene kits in place at all levels of government. If you're expecting FEMA to do it, that's not a sound plan. I'm wanting to move my staff out of the agency offices and our regional offices and headquarters, and I want to put them and embed them every day with state and local agencies and move out so that I can be part of the conversation every day. Not just being seen in the response and the recovery realm, but I want to be seen every day, planning, training, exercising, and executing together. Finally, the third goal, reduce the complexity of FEMA. As I said, I'm my own worst critic. I know we've got to streamline some processes. Specifically, we got to streamline the disaster survivor process. We have to streamline the disaster grantee and sub-grantee process, and that takes a lot of work. Ultimately, I'm asking for your help. I'm committed to leading FEMA to ultimately help prepare this nation and make it more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator. Chair now recognizes Major General Jackson.
Chairman Mccaul, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Corps conducts emergency response activities under two basic authorities, the Stafford Act and Public Law 8499. Under the Stafford Act, we support FEMA under the National Response Framework as the lead federal agency for Emergency Support Function 3, Public Works and Engineering. ESF 3 provides temporary emergency power, temporary roofing, debris management, infrastructure assessment, critical public facility restoration, and temporary housing. Under PL 8499, we plan, prepare for, and recover from disasters in coordination with local, state, and federal partners. When disasters occur, Corps teams and other resources are mobilized from across the command to assist local offices with their response to the event. As part of this mission, the Corps has more than 50 specially trained teams supported by emergency contracts which perform the wide range of ESF-3 support missions. The Corps uses pre-awarded contracts that can be quickly activated for missions, such as debris removal, temporary roofing, and generator installation. This year, the Corps has supported FEMA-led federal response and recovery operations in support of multiple events, including wildfires in California and hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Two of our divisions are currently fighting seasonal flooding along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers today and their tributaries. The Corps was given 3 mission assignments by FEMA in support of Southern California wildfires and mudslides. Debris removal is complete in 10 of 11 debris basins and channel reaches across 6 cities. We expect this to be complete by the end of April. The Corps was given 7 mission assignments by FEMA in support of Northern California wildfires. 85% of private property debris removal and remediation is complete in Lake, Mendocino, Napa, and Sonoma counties. We expect this to be complete by the end of March. The Corps was given 27 mission assignments by FEMA in support of Hurricane Harvey response and recovery. This included missions in all 6 ESF-3 mission areas to include navigation restoration under our PL 8499 authority. Temporary housing, critical public facilities, and debris management support is ongoing. The Corps was given 46 Irma-related mission assignments and 39 Maria-related mission assignments by FEMA. This included missions, again, in all 6 ESF-3 mission areas to include navigation restoration, levee, and dam safety under our 8499 authority. As of this morning, the Corps has completed over 2,100 temporary generator installations in the Caribbean, including 180 in the U.S. Virgin Islands and over 1,900 in Puerto Rico. The mission is complete in the U.S. Virgin Islands, with 890 generators still installed at critical facilities across Puerto Rico. Under FEMA authority, we continue to assist Puerto Rico with operation and maintenance of critical non-federal generators across the island, and 5 of 9 1 to 2 megawatt microgrids installed in support of power grid restoration in Puerto Rico remain in service today. This includes 1 in Vieques. We expect a temporary power mission to end mid-May. The Corps has completed over 78,000 temporary roofing installations, including over 13,000 in Florida, over 3,600 in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and over 59,000 in Puerto Rico. Missions in Florida and the U.S. Virgin Islands are complete, and we have less than 300 remaining to complete in Puerto Rico. We expect to be complete by the first week of April. Corps debris subject matter experts provided technical assistance to Florida and Georgia in response to Hurricane Irma. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, debris removal is 94% complete, with final pickup scheduled today for St. Thomas and St. John. In Puerto Rico, debris removal is 92% complete. Our debris teams are actively working in 38 municipalities, with debris removal complete in 17 municipalities. We expect to be complete with all debris removal and disposal by mid-June. The Corps worked closely with officials in Texas and Florida to manage local flood control reservoirs during periods of unprecedented rainfall. In Puerto Rico, Corps dam and levee teams inspected 17 priority dams and worked closely with the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, or PREPA, to stabilize a spillway failure at the Guajataca Dam. On 30 September, the Corps was given a FEMA mission assignment under Stafford Act authority to assist the Commonwealth in conducting emergency repairs to the power grid itself. Unlike our ESF-3 missionaries, the Corps did not have pre-awarded contracts to use for this effort. Instead, we competitively awarded contracts for temporary power generation, line repair, and logistics support and transportation required to support the mission. This included acquiring over $283 million in materials critical to the restoration effort, many with unique specifications for the Puerto Rican grid. The Corps is partnering with PREPA in this effort and have energized almost 92% of customers thus far. In coordination with FEMA, PREPA, and the Commonwealth, we have begun to gradually right-size our contracted workforce. Demobilization of Corps line repair contractors will be complete late April. Remaining work will be turned over to crews under the control of PREPA. The Corps will continue to operate turbines at Palo Seco and Yabucoa through late April as PREPA completes repairs to the plants at these sites. Remaining materials will be used to complete grid repairs and replenish depleted inventories on the island through mid-May. The Corps remains committed and capable of executing its other civil works activities across the nation despite our heavy involvement in these ongoing response and recovery operations. We also remain ready and poised to assist in future events as they may occur. This concludes my testimony, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kelly for his statement.
Chairman Mccaul, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss FEMA's preparedness and response capabilities to the 2017 hurricanes, as well as my office's oversight efforts. First, I would like to applaud the dedicated women and men who quickly answered the call, rolled up their sleeves, and began the difficult work to help the people affected by 3 major hurricanes. Harvey, Irma, and Maria made landfall within 4 weeks of each other. According to NOAA, these storms rank as 3 of the 5 most expensive storms in U.S. history, making the 2017 hurricane season the costliest season in U.S. history. This even topped the 2005 season that included Hurricane Katrina. In response to the unprecedented disasters in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico, the OIG deployed staff from our local offices as well as other auditors, analysts, and criminal investigators from around the country. OIG staff on the ground creates an independent unit that oversees disaster response and recovery activities, detects and alerts FEMA of systemic problems, helps ensure accountability over federal funds, and identifies potential risks and vulnerabilities that provide stakeholders with timely information to address operational challenges. The presence of our criminal investigators assures stakeholders that DHS OIG is an integral part of the Department of Justice's zero-tolerance policy. Our investigators work in partnership with the Justice's National Center for Disaster Fraud to receive complaints and identify trends. They also actively participate with local task forces established by the U.S. attorneys. Finally, they brief FEMA and multi-jurisdictional task forces on fraud, waste, and abuse. It is disappointing, but disasters often result in an uptick in fraud. In fiscal year 2017, we received more than 4,800 FEMA-related hotline complaints. In the first 5 months of fiscal year 2018, we received over 14,600 hotline complaints. That is more than triple the total amount we received in 2017. From these complaints, we initiated already 220 investigations of Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria issues, and these numbers continue to grow every day. For the 2017 hurricane season, FEMA faced both situational challenges caused by the magnitude of the disasters and systemic challenges that have persisted over time. Responding to 3 major hurricanes at one time is difficult. In 2017, the response was further complicated by Hurricanes Irma and Maria, devastating the Caribbean islands of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which were remote, not easily accessible locations. This poses additional logistical challenges to an already overtaxed response workforce. To further complicate matter, much of the infrastructure was already in disrepair prior to the damages caused by the hurricanes. In addition to the situational challenges, FEMA faces persistent systemic vulnerabilities such as improper procurement practices, duplication of benefits, inadequate staffing, grant management issues, privacy vulnerabilities, protecting survivors' home and property from further damages, and providing funds to high-risk entities. If left unmitigated, these challenges could delay survivor recovery and put billions of federal dollars at risk. To this end, we've issued several lesson learned reports addressing FEMA's disaster preparedness and response to recovery efforts. This work highlights ongoing concerns that FEMA must address to ensure it effectively meets its mission and improves the efficiency and effectiveness of program operations. Looking forward, the challenges identified during the recent disasters highlight the importance of proactive and thorough oversight, as well as continual improvement of FEMA in executing its mission. As agents of positive change, we have over 30 ongoing and planned reviews and strive to make recommendations that improve FEMA's efficiency and effectiveness, positively affect disaster survivors, and safeguard public funds. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my oral statement. I welcome any questions you or members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I now recognize myself for questions. Administrator, first, let me commend you for your emergency response efforts in my home state of Texas. Katy High School turned into a forward operating base with the National Guard active duty. We saw the Coast Guard. We saw private citizens, the Cajun Navy, and FEMA was there to pre-position assets after the president declared it an emergency. And I think that made a big difference. But I think there's some also confusion about the role of FEMA versus the role that the state and locals have to play as well, working as a team together in the recovery efforts. I did speak with my Governor Abbott, recently, who one of his frustrations was he had to deal with so many different organizations. And I know we've talked about this. What is your vision to possibly streamline and make more efficient FEMA process in these disasters?
Thank you for the question. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that Governor Abbott is one of the most bold governors who has truly owned every bit of the disaster response and recovery, and that's the way it should work. I believe that Texas is a model. And I say that because it truly is where we need to go as federally supported, state managed, locally executed. FEMA is not a first responder. FEMA should not be the primary and only responder. My job is to work directly with governors to understand what the response and recovery goals or the preparedness goals, mitigation goals are, organize our resources to help that governor achieve those goals. And in Texas, I do believe that that's the model that was played out, and that's the model we should be seeking for. The problem particularly is what's complex is housing. And as I said, I would like to lay out a new vision for housing, but it would require granting authorities being given to me to help from the Congress to reorganize it. For example, we're not housing experts. We're literally good at doing emergency housing provisions. We're good at sheltering. We're good at blue tarp missions with the Army Corps of Engineers. We're good at transitional shelter authority. We put nearly 4.7 million people in hotels, or 4.7 million nights in hotels has been coordinated to this point. It would take a person over, it was like 12,000 years to stay in hotels that many nights. Let us identify what we're good at. Give the governors more granting authority to handle the difficult housing issues, and then clearly design the handoff between FEMA and the partnering agencies. Streamline what we're all responsible for, how we should work together. And in some cases, the disaster survivor may get up to 15 knocks at the door from FEMA to other federal government agencies, from the state governments to non-governmental organizations, and it's confusing. We have to do one inspection that cuts across the federal government perspective and down through the agencies. We have to streamline what we're doing.
I think that's absolutely right. A one-stop shop, and I look forward to working with you on legislation and granting authority for you as well. Major General, this is a map that Army Corps, you've probably seen this, I've talked about it a lot. They made this, did this in 1940, and it created the Barker Addicks Dam. But Cypress Creek, there's a proposed levee system that was never built. So what happened in Hurricane Harvey was that Cypress Creek overflowed, went into Barker and Addicts Reservoir. Then a controlled spillage was done at about 1:30 in the morning, and those residents downstream were not very happy about that. It filled up the bayous, and then it flooded downtown Houston. So it had sort of a cascading effect here. This gets more into flood mitigation. I think, you always hear an ounce of, the prevention piece is so important. Can you tell me whether the Cypress Creek Reservoir, or the third reservoir, is on your list of projects?
Congressman, thanks. I can see from here, even without my glasses, that's a 1940s plan. And I think you'll agree that a lot has changed in the hydrology of the region, upstream and downstream, since 1940. A lot of development, which increases significantly the runoff. To answer your question, though, we have a number of projects that we have identified that we're going to try to put forth to the administration for funding in the supplemental that Congress passed, to be able to take a look at that reservoir, other opportunities to improve the flood protection.
My time's getting ready. If I could just say, it's the governor's #1 priority. He told me that, and it's also my #1 priority, is to get that Cypress Reservoir built and reinforce Barker Addicts to make sure this doesn't happen again. 58 inches of rain is a lot of rain. We also put language in the supplemental for $90 billion to expedite some of these projects, so I would hope you would be able to do this as quickly as possible. I think one of the concerns we always have with the Army Corps is it takes too long, the studies and the actual construction. And I think that's something that Congress has given you new authorities to do it more expeditiously. And I look forward to working with you to get this done as quickly as possible, because it's flooded 3 times in 2 years. And it really, again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We need to get this thing done. So with that, I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, you talked about some improvements that you hope to see in FEMA going forward. Would you share those written improvements with this committee?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Are they complete at this time?
Yeah, so what we try to do is, I believe, in streamlined and concise documents. Basically, this is an outline of the entire strategic plan on one page that outlines our goals and objectives. Yes, sir.
Very good. So is your testimony also that you have all the money you need to do your job?
Can I get back to you on that? I do. I'm very thankful for the supplementals that went forward. I do have a concern that with the magnitude of this event, I have the ability in FEMA to reimburse everybody but myself. And one of the problems that I think we're running into within the agency is that the operational budget and staffing pattern, as Mr. Kelly alluded to, doesn't grow with the disaster response. And so the amount of paperwork, the requests that come into the agency is exponentially increased with a year like this, but the staffing pattern internally to my agency stays the same.
So that means you're gonna get back with me?
Yes, sir. I would be happy to respond to you in writing. Thank you.
You got a time frame on that? On your response?
Can I have 2 weeks, sir?
You have it.
Thank you.
Is it also your testimony that the response to Florida, Texas, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands was acceptable under FEMA's present standards?
Well, I think the term acceptable lies in the eye of the beholder. I'm sure that there are people that feel that FEMA slighted them out in the field and didn't give them the assistance that they deserved. It's very tough to deal with each and every community. But as a whole, as I said, I'm very proud of the response that was put forward, and the model of federally supported, state managed, and locally executed played out in California, Texas, and Florida. In regards to Puerto Rico, we're still pushing forward every day. I believe we still have 3,000 staff in place along with the local hires that are there. And in regards to things like food and commodity, The amount of commodities that we put into Puerto Rico is one of the estimates I saw was close to $2 billion. That alone would rank as one of our top 20 most costly disasters in the history of FEMA.
I thank you for that, but I'm trying to get Brock Long's opinion as to whether or not you are confident that the response to Texas, Florida, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico was acceptable to your standards. I'm not talking about anybody else.
I would say, yes, it was acceptable, but do we have room for improvement? Always. Always. Yes.
What room for improvements would you ask for?
Here again, improvement is not just my agency, it's the emergency management profession as a whole. And what I mean by that is, as I said, catastrophic readiness bothers me from a low to no notice standpoint of, do all counties, do states have their own ability to push water ice MREs and life-saving commodities? Have they actually written disaster cost recovery plans that will help them understand how to receive funding from 17 different government agencies, and they're outcome driven when it comes to, they know how they're going to mitigate their communities when these dollars arrive, and they know what their goals are going to be? You know, are we pre-planning up front at all levels of government and doing it in an integrated fashion to where we are pushing forward to do the greatest good with the taxpaying dollars?
So can you get this committee in writing what you consider the acceptable consequences for the response to those 4 disasters?
Sure. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, Administrator Long, I understand that the Trump administration is requiring Puerto Rico to use public assistance alternative procedures on a permanent work projects as a condition of receiving public assistance grants. Why is Puerto Rico being treated differently than other areas?
We're not treating Puerto Rico differently, and everything that we've done with Governor Rosselló, we've been playing phone tag this morning and as of yesterday as well, is everything is negotiated. We believe that the Section 428 in the Stafford Act is the most prudent way to move forward, and we briefed the governors, and ultimately he requested that. This is not, we don't strong arm people into doing things by any means. That's not the way I want to conduct business. The reason we went with 428 is because of the sheer magnitude of the amount of damage to the infrastructure and the deferred maintenance problems that we ran into. For example, there were thousands of roadway obstructions. It would be too cumbersome, it would be too costly for FEMA to write a project worksheet for each one of those obstructions that could be reversioned and reversioned time and time again, and then FEMA ends up being there for 20 years. The 428 program.
I'm reclaiming my time. Mr. Chair, I'd like to have your response to that specific question in writing back to the committee.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ranking member yields back. Per the agreement with the ranking member's UC request, I now recognize Ms. Velasquez for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for the opportunity to speak here today. I also want to recognize you both for your leadership in examining the aftermath of last year's unprecedented hurricane season. This work is critical because our disaster response capabilities must continually evolve to meet the types of frequencies of the disasters that we face. While much has been debated about the federal government's response to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, I am here today to find solutions. I am worried about the emotional toll that these unprecedented hurricanes have taken upon the people of Puerto Rico. I am here today because the people of Puerto Rico are losing hope. More than 300,000 have left the island. And I am here because I'm worried that before we know it, hurricane season will be before us again. The truth is, before the hurricanes made landfall, it was widely known that if a natural disaster, especially one of catastrophic proportions, were to hit the island, the most vulnerable asset was Puerto Rico's energy grid. And as everyone in this room knows, this turned out to be the case. So months after the hurricanes, some areas still look as they were hit yesterday. I was in my hometown of Yabucoa 2 weeks ago, where Maria made landfall. It looks like the hurricane struck yesterday. They still desperately need our help. So today, as we near the half year, I want to say to you, Mr. Chairman, we are all keenly aware of what is at stake come June, when hurricane season starts again. As we hear from FEMA, the Army Corps, DHS, and local officials, I want to make sure we all coalesce, leaving behind our political inclinations, and we work to come up with a meaningful plan for future disaster. One that will allow us to proactively deploy federal resources and prevent the mistakes of the past. Mr. Long, we all knew Hurricane Irma, Hurricane 5, Category 5, was in its track to hit Puerto Rico, and we all knew how vulnerable Puerto Rico was in terms of the power grid. What steps proactively, knowing what we knew then, we need to take in order to be quickly there, to deploy the federal assets that we need, not to wait 2 weeks later to send the comfort when we know that no hospital in Puerto Rico will have electricity. The people in Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Texas, Florida, California, and frankly, all those subject to the wrath of climate change destruction need to have the full faith and confidence in the institutions meant to keep America safe. I look forward to hearing about what has worked so far and what gaps this committee can address moving forward. Thank you again for allowing me to participate today, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back and now recognize Delegate Plaskett for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. It's not coming on. There it is. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Mccaul and Ranking Member Thompson, for the opportunity to say a few words before the committee for this hearing on preparedness, response, and rebuilding. As we all know now, Hurricanes Irma and Maria caused dozens of injuries and some deaths in my district, the U.S. Virgin Islands. The damage from the storms, the psychological and long-term economic impact is unparalleled, as the occurrence of 2 Category 5 hurricanes, making landfall in a specific area over a span of 2 weeks. Recovery is far from over and the rebuilding has yet to begin. The catastrophic destruction caused by the hurricanes continue to demand massive amounts of aid to address the overwhelming needs of the victims who very much remain faced with the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. I'll give you a couple of examples of where this is quite evident. It has been found that approximately 19,000 homes have been damaged. However, the Army Corps installed 3,658 blue roofs. It became a long negotiation with FEMA for approval and spending for the Sheltered Restoration and Essential Power Program, the STEP program, the federal government's ingenious alternative to temporary housing to get people back in their homes rather putting them in temporary shelters long term. This rapid repair program, as it's called, was announced late February. That would be September is the hurricane, February, 6 months after the storms, and homeowners are still awaiting inspection and approvals. The next hurricane season begins June 1st. Mounds of hurricane debris, a second example being, including appliances and scrap metal, are disposed near public schools and pose real health and safety risks to the people. Debris removal on St. Thomas and St. John was managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. On St. Croix, 3 times the size of St. Thomas, debris collection was run by the local government. Debris was collected 3 times faster on St. Croix as it was on St. Thomas. And you heard testimony here this morning that they are going to be picking up that debris for removal from the islands this week. That's for islands that are on St. Thomas, 32 square miles, and 84 square miles of space on St. Croix. 6 months for debris removal. As of today, the period of the 100% federal cost share for debris removal and emergency protective measures has ended, although Congress has requested an extension from FEMA. I would ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter written by the Governor of the Virgin Islands on February 14th, 2018, requesting an extension of debris removal, 100% federal cost share, and a March 13th letter from Ranking Member Peter DeFazio of the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, and your own Ranking Member Benny Thompson on the Committee on Homeland Security, requesting of the President that this extension be granted.
And without objections to order.
Thank you. Progress has been made, but despite best collective efforts, the Territory has not physically been able to finish all of these projects by March 15th deadline, and it simply does not have the financial resources able to cover the local match on the remainder. The Territory is still awaiting modular structure for use by schools and medical centers. Until then, public schooling for the children of the Virgin Islands is operating on 4-hour rotations. This is expected to continue at least into the next school year, and access to care at hospitals remains limited. As a result, dialysis patients, inpatient care, and other services in the entire U.S. Virgin Islands remain off-island. Congress has set up a system where FEMA structural demands that it guards its budget and gives only when requested or pressed by local governments. This is a structure which must be changed. It does not support the best interests of American citizens living in disaster areas. FEMA has to, and as we've heard here, is willing and needs the support of Congress to streamline the processes so that results and support can get to the people. The examples I've given are just a few of the issues that the Virgin Islands remains faced with 6 months after Irma and Maria, and I look forward to the discussion and more questions on how to resolve these issues. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Resident Commissioner Gonzalez for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and all members, ranking members of this committee, for calling this hearing and allow us to be here in such an important matter. And I'll thank the witness for answering the call and coming before Congress to answer for the response to an unprecedented disaster that affected millions of American citizens, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. It's been more than 5 months now, and since we saw that, an event that none of us expected to see in American soil in our lifetimes. As I mentioned in a prior committee testimony, the jurisdiction of the size of Connecticut, if that kind of jurisdiction lost all power generation and distribution capabilities, and most of the communication system collapsed, nobody would allow Connecticut to be without power for so many months. That's the size of Puerto Rico. We live in a scenario of the failure of all technological resources on which we counted for our daily lives. I think that when we check on that, we still got 90% of generation, but that doesn't mean people got power in their homes. And when you are looking to what is the goal to finish the job, most of the agencies are saying that could be even March or even May of this year. So we're talking about 5 or 6 months waiting for power, not to account the hundreds of people with diseases or medical conditions that require for them to get a generator or have power in their houses. According to FEMA and to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, this has been the biggest mission to restore utilities in those agencies' history. Yet, millions of Puerto Ricans ask themselves, what is taking so long? One of my biggest questions will be how much more resources both agencies need to finish the job. How long it would take to finish the last line of help in the center part of the island, which is, we still got a lot of towns with less than 40% of power. All things are currently current under discussion, but the estimate of the Corps is that the restoration should be done by the end of March. And we're not talking about having a reliable system or a resilient system. We're talking about the level of destruction defy everyone's expectation. But my biggest concern will be here, it's that are we or any part of America spending months with their utilities down? What should happen? You will have a lot of people angry, waiting for that kind of response. So I do think the people of Puerto Rico are being very patient, waiting to receive that kind of help. We know that our Asian infrastructure was in a bad shape before the hurricane, and that's the reason I thank all members of this committee and the members of the House who voted for assigning the resources in the last supplemental. I think that supplemental will help the island of Puerto Rico in terms of to recover. One of my biggest questions will be how long it will take. What do you need to finish the job in 30 days? We cannot say that May or June or July are the best scenario for finish and having a 100% recovery of the island. We're going to face the hurricane season again during this summer. So this is one of the biggest challenge we got, and I do ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to allow a letter that I just sent to Commanding General Semonit and District Commander Jason Kirk to the Army Corps of Engineers, asking them to extend the mission of the U.S. Army Corps and the contracts that are being provided to the island that are set to expire in March 19 and April 7, if you allow that to happen, Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Of course, we got a lot of questions, but the biggest of all those questions will be, do we have the resources? Do we have the materials? Do we have the crews to handle those issues? I do know that that's not the mission of the Corps of Engineers, but in a moment like this, we want you to finish the work you begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back. We'll go back to members of the full committee. Mr. Rogers from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Long, good to have you here. It's refreshing to finally have a witness that doesn't have an accent before this committee. But before I get to my questions, I wanted to address some of the comments about local government officials being disgruntled after a disaster. I've been in this business 32 years. I was elected as a local county commissioner first and then served in the legislature in 16 years here. Seen a lot of disasters over that period of time. These are traumatic events that are overwhelming to communities, and it is a Herculean effort to come in and try to do recovery. I have always seen disgruntled local officials, and we always will. There's never going to be the perfect recovery, but we need to remember how far we've come. After the hurricane that struck New Orleans, that was a very poor performance. By anybody's standard. But FEMA has come a long way since then. I was on this committee and down in New Orleans during that period, but the last FEMA administrator was a complete pro and brought that department a long way, and this FEMA administrator is top quality too. And they're doing a good job. They've done a really good job in this last year with these overwhelming numbers of disasters. We need to keep in mind that perfection is never going to happen. But with that, Mr. Long, there was a story that came out that disturbed me. It was in February. It said, it was reported that an entrepreneur, Tiffany Brown, was awarded a $156 million contract to provide some 30 million meals to Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. She delivered only 50,000 with only some limited staff working for her. And then the story went on to describe how shoddy those meals were and how incapable she really was. And it turns out she had been getting government contracts from a lot of different departments over the years that she was not able to perform. How's that happening? I mean, it's just not happening in FEMA. How did this woman get this huge contract that she couldn't keep, fortunately? We got somebody professional that took it, but how did it happen?
So there was never, through the federal awardee procurement systems that we use government-wide, particularly FEMA as well, there was never an alert on the background that this company was not able to perform to to meet the ramifications of the contract. And let me back up to talk about the magnitude of this year as well when it comes to procurement and contracts. Going into the 2017 hurricane season, we had 59 pre-positioned contracts to do water ice, MREs, blue tarps, plastic sheeting, whatever. We had to initiate 1,973 additional contracts to cover the entire country from California to the Virgin Islands. Out of the nearly 2,000 contracts we had, only 3 were canceled, Tribute being one of them. But there was no alert process that went through that said, stay away from this company. Now, of the 2 companies that defaulted on the 3 contracts, 2 of them, no tax-paying dollars went out to. You're correct. We spent $225,000 on 50,000 meals which were delivered. They were not packaged correctly, in my opinion, and the timing of getting the meals, for whatever reasons, they defaulted on the contract. We canceled it in our due diligence. 3 out of 1,973 contracts were canceled. The problem with it is that now my agency, as a result of going through this, because there may have been other parts of the government that didn't do their due diligence to throw the red flags into the system, now it's incumbent upon my agency to make sure that if the actions that were not taken or if they were trying to defraud us or whatever, that we alert them into the systems and follow the debarment process if deemed necessary.
Okay. Let me ask, shifting gears, during these multiple disasters, how did your emergency communications work? Given the fact that powers, we just heard, power's been out for so long, did that affect your ability for your first responders to communicate with each other and communicate with local folks?
So obviously, as I said in my opening statement, the problem is we do not have a resilient and a redundant communications network. So every
Why?
day, well, because I think we got to reach out to the private sector partners that we're being desensitized to our cell phones and to digital technologies. We're stepping away from landlines. But in the California wildfires, a good portion of the capability was burned up. A good portion of the capability was blown out by Hurricane Irma and Maria. And anytime you lose the ability to communicate, 2 things happen. You lose situational awareness, you lose the ability to, for example, in my opinion, it wasn't that there wasn't enough food and water on the island of Puerto Rico, it was communicating to people where to go to get it. And it makes everything difficult. We have to go back and navigate by stars, per se, to enter people into our individual assistance programs. And so we have to strike up a very, thoughtful conversation with the private sector vendors of how do we build a system that doesn't go down. It's prepared for all hazards so that we don't lose that capability. It's crucial. It's beyond FEMA's ability to do it.
Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas is recognized.
Let me thank the chairman and ranking member for a very wise effort. I hope that we can have succeeding hearings on the ongoing recovery of our respective communities. Let me acknowledge that to date, and the numbers may be somewhat inaccurate, but let me offer to say that there were 88 deaths due to Hurricane Harvey in the state of Texas and about 30 as of September 4th in my surrounding area, including my constituents who were a family of 6 who drowned trying to escape in northeast Houston. I think it is important to acknowledge again that when we speak for our brothers and sisters in the Virgin Islands, in Puerto Rico, certainly in Florida and Louisiana, and certainly in California. We speak in 2 different formats. One, in appreciation, being at the command station from the moment Hurricane Harvey hit, being based at the George R. Brown Convention Center in Houston, there was no doubt that it was a collective effort, that we were dependent upon the FEMA's rescue part of their work, and certainly along with them, the Coast Guard. And I personally am reminded of the first responders as we were sitting, police and fire, with 2 phones to our ears as people were calling in to be rescued. Those were difficult and dangerous and troubling times that many of my colleagues have been involved in their own respective districts. So, Administrator, let me first of all say thank you. And of course, as you well know, I had more than 300 plus individuals gathered in my district, not even enough, on Monday last, who were denials, people in hotels that were crying and frustrated about whether they could stay or find housing. And so we are still in a period of recovery. And I think it is important to express appreciation, but also to be honest on where we are today. Let me quickly try to express my interest and concern with breaking up FEMA or having FEMA have components of the rescue period, which is that early stage, and then long-term recovery. I have a text on my phone from a pastor who indicates that inspectors came and there was 4 feet of water and they said it was 4 inches and denied. My meeting was based upon recovery and asked people to bring their denial letters, and I must say all of our local officials will acknowledge that the numbers of denials in our community were enormous. They particularly hit minority communities. In this text, it indicated the inspectors were not assessing some of our older homes properly. And one statement, of which I am trying to research, but I think it's important, that there were too many black employees that were hired that were temporary. We hope that that is not true. But my question to you is, what are your thoughts about reforming FEMA on the rescue, immediate, and then the long-term part of it? As you answer that question, would you answer the question about the enormous number of vacancies that I hope to put into the record, ask unanimous consent to put into the record the list of vacancies, which are enormous, and I don't want to take time to call them, at FEMA. I don't know how you could possibly do your job, as you've indicated, with there's so many vacancies. And then the question with our
Without objection, so ordered.
resources, the Texas General Land Office is trying to staff up. We need 90. I understand there's 33. I don't know if FEMA will help with the monies coming in that are part of FEMA assistance dollars to be able to help do the housing part of the second half of the work. So could you start on the reordering of FEMA and the staffing and how we're going to recover? Let me also acknowledge Mayor Turner and our Harris County Judge, the governor, all of us working together. I yield to you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So in regards to the response, you know, it's my job to coordinate the firepower of 32 federal government agencies down to do the life-saving, life-sustaining mission, which, from where I sit, was pretty unprecedented, the number of lives that were saved and different things that are there. The problem is that it's got to be more than FEMA from the standpoint in the recovery, but I believe it starts on the preparedness end, and it goes back to a true culture of preparedness. For example, there's too much of an insurance gap, and we learned that in Harvey. We learned that in Texas alone, that we got to go back to the basics to say that any house can flood regardless if you're shown in a flood map or not. We have to double the number of insurance policies, and you know, the level of assistance that FEMA puts out on average through individual assistance is like $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. If you're properly insured, the average payout in Harris County right now is like $110,000. How do we help people get insurance and properly insured to speed up their recovery? I cannot make people whole, as you realize. And you know, the toughest part is we still have a huge population in hotels, and the toughest part is transitioning them out of the hotel and into more of a housing solution that's on their property. That's going to require more than FEMA again. We're not housing experts, and that's where I'm asking for the granting authority to be able to give the governor the ability to purchase their own trailers, purchase their own innovative housing, you know, tech capabilities that are out there. I believe that a governor can do it faster, quicker, and cheaper than FEMA ever can, because I'm having to physically buy manufactured homes. I'm having to, you know, use through the defense production authorities that I have. It's a cumbersome, time-consuming process. I proactively put travel trailers back on the table because there's more volume and easier access to travel trailers to be able to do that. But I'm not the housing expert. We have to have more conversations with HUD, with SBA, with our governors to say what is the right mix, what are the swim lanes and capabilities that we need. Thank you.
General, his time has expired. I recognize Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for your attendance. I'm over here. I'll start as a guy who has worked in in this arena a little bit, state disasters and some federal disasters as a Pennsylvania Guardsman. I'm just wondering, especially in these broad-scale disasters, from FEMA's standpoint and from the Corps' standpoint as well, is there anything that the Guard can do better? Is there anything that inhibits us? And I know that it's hard to pre-position certain, you don't know what you need sometimes until you need it, right? And you have different states with, and different services, whether it's the Air Guard or the Army Guard, with different requirements and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering, from your standpoint, is there anything that we fall short on, or is there anything that we can improve state to state to respond and be helpful and responsive in a critical time of need?
Well, first of all, my hat's off to the National Guard. I mean, here again, they're one of the most critical partners that we have, and one of the most critical assets that a governor has. And we saw them do yeoman's work when it comes to delivering water ice MREs to saving lives. The issues that have been raised to me by General Lengel and others, and as well as governors, falls in line with the Emergency Management Mutual Aid Assistance Compacts and EMAC,
Right.
and the speed in which the National Guard assets are reimbursed. I don't have the authority. If a governor, if you were the governor of New York and say you and Governor Rosselló worked out an EMAC deal and you're going to provide Governor Rosselló your National Guard, I don't have the ability to reimburse you directly. All my reimbursement authority of the Stafford Act has to go through the governor to you, so you're dependent upon that governor, the requesting governor, reimbursing you back. And that's the problem as I understand it. I don't know how to solve that problem.
So that's not a FEMA relationship, so to speak. It's more of a Guard Bureau to state relationship,
EMAC
as you understand it?
Yeah, so EMAC is a governor-to-governor contract. And quite frankly, I don't know if you want FEMA involved in that governor.
I'm not saying we do. I just want to know where the shortcomings are so we can try and improve.
Right. So that's it. If I get involved, then they've got to adhere to my procurement rules, 2 CFR Part 200, and honestly, you don't want that.
So it's essentially just the speed between which governors come to agreement and then inform you.
Right, and then reimburse each other.
Okay.
They have to cut that contract up front.
Okay. Another question. I'm sensitive to some of the things that my good friend Ms. Gonzalez spoke to regarding power, and per the information I have, it's, September 20th was when the hurricane hit Puerto Rico. Irma, I think, about 10 days prior, so they already sustained damage from Irma, and now we're nearly 7 months on, right? It's March. March 20th will be 7 months. And from the information I have, Puerto Rico's power's been restored. And I'm curious about generation versus, because the information I have says power's been restored to customers 90%. Virgin Islands 99.8, St. Thomas 99.1, or St. Croix, St. Thomas and St. Croix. So the question I have is we had a hearing some time ago about how many crews the folks that are restoring the power, whether it's generation or whether it's distribution on the island, how many crews were available? And we get the situation with PREPA, how bad the infrastructure was prior to the storm, and that the ports of entry, whether air or sea, were damaged heavily, and it just made it hard, even if you had pre-positioned assets, all those things withstanding. How many crews do you know, if you do know, are still on the ground on the island and to do this work? How many do you think are required?
I would need to yield to General Jackson.
Sure, absolutely.
He owns the contracts for that. Thank you.
Sure, Congressman, thanks for that. At the height of the activity on Puerto Rico, where we had the most number of boots on the ground, we had about 6,000 line workers that were a combination of what fell underneath the Corps of Engineers Command and Control and what fell underneath the contracts that PREPA is managing. Today, we have, the Corps of Engineers has about 1,317 folks on the ground. PREPA has 2,100 or so, 2,200 line workers on the ground. That's changed over time. There's something called a Unified Command Group, which is headed by Mr. Carlos Torres, who's the governor's storm response coordinator. He's the one who leads a group, includes FEMA, Corps of Engineers, and includes PREPA leadership and representatives from the governor's office. And every day they meet and they take a look at material availability, prioritization of line repair, and they make decisions on how lines are assigned, what requirements are out there in terms
Sir,
of
sir, I don't want to cut you short, but I'm out of time here. I am interested to know what your estimate is of 100% distribution completion on the island, if you know that. It's been a
Congressman,
long time to be without power. I mean, you can imagine, right?
Yes, it has been a long time. We've estimated that it would be probably mid-May before 100% of all
Mid-May.
the stuff is done. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Payne's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here, and appreciate your testimony. Staying focused on the territories, in Puerto Rico, nearly 1 in 3 schools lacks electricity, and many also lack consistent access to clean water. This has forced many schools to operate on a limited daily schedule, leading to school-age children in Puerto Rico missing out on more than 20 million full days of learning. What plans do you have in place to ensure that no displaced child is out of an educational setting for more than 30 days in the future?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to you in writing on that. I don't know.
Well, we have situations that I've brought up in the past surrounding children and their needs during disasters. And, we feel that more attention has to be paid to the special circumstances, not being with their parents reconnecting with them after disasters. The example that I use the most is several years ago, the tornadoes in Oklahoma. There was an issue about reuniting children with their parents after the situation, and also the need to identify areas of learning. Their daycare centers sometimes aren't listed, and first responders just went right past, because they're in private areas. So we need to designate how we locate children as well in these areas. But it's something that, I've been a proponent of making sure that we have some type of, they're not little people, they're children, and so they need guidance and someone to look out for them during these issues as they arise, and then being reunified with their parents. So please, as you formulate, your mission going forward, that you keep that in mind, and also, we can discuss it more at a later date.
And just a couple of resources. We do have resources for children in disasters. I agree with you. We have to do more. I have 2 young boys, 11 and 8. And I think but here again, this is far greater than FEMA. This is a partnership with FEMA, non-governmental organizations, and the Department of Education, for example, because there are tons of statistics. For example, spousal abuse goes up after disasters, all types of things. So we have to be able to recognize these things. But here again, I don't know if FEMA is the expertise when it comes to this, and we need partners. The other thing is that FEMA in the past has developed programs such as INMETS. It's the National Mass Evacuation Tracking Systems for large-scale disaster evacuations, of trying to reconnect. We've established family reunification concepts after disasters as well. And it might just be we need to further promote and train at the local and state level as to what the availability of our resources are. But thank you, sir.
Absolutely. And, last year, FEMA had the National Advisory Council recommend the creation of something along that line of support, Center of Excellence, type training for emergency preparedness. So, that might be an area to look at as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, all three of you, for coming and sharing your expertise with us. I am the chairman of the subcommittee of this committee that deals with emergency preparedness, response, and communications. And 5 minutes of questioning, even with all my colleagues, there's not enough time for us to delve into all the areas of, as we've put it as the title of this hearing, lessons learned. So I was wondering if there's a way you could compile for us the lessons that we've learned from these disasters. It's absolutely amazing to me the amount of disasters that you had to deal with simultaneously or consecutively with the resources that you have. And we haven't even talked about the wildfires and the mudslides in California, the amount of hurricanes we've had. And in my role as chairman, it would be very helpful to us if we had a compilation of all the things that you have learned from this that we could help you for future, because places like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, they're going to get hit with other hurricanes. And we do get, and my understanding is from my colleagues who live in tornado areas or even earthquake areas, there's not much warning there. But with hurricanes, we follow these models, these patterns from storms developing off the coast of Africa and figure out, try to predict where they're going to hit. So it would be very helpful to us if we had that so we could help you. In my role, I visited Puerto Rico about 3 weeks after the storm, and then recently with Jennifer went down to, and John Rutherford went down to see how the recovery is coming. The island was consumed. The storm was bigger than the island. It sat over there. My recollection is it moved at about 8 miles an hour after it hit landfall, and for 36 hours dumped more rain than Puerto Rico experiences in its entire year. The ground couldn't absorb it. When we flew over in Black Hawk helicopters with outdoors, and I told you in the muster room, I'm afraid of heights. But we went up to visit the island and to observe all the devastation. The island was brown. Yeah, and the challenges of getting supplies to folks who are just isolated because they are an island. And I suspect when you have a disaster that you're responding to in the mainland, you could drive supplies to, you have them pre-staged somewhere, and after the storm's over, you get, it's very difficult, the airport being closed, the port being closed, your first responders on Puerto Rico being victims themselves. Very challenging. And we witnessed when we went back a few weeks ago to see how, General, you have to take telephone poles by helicopter up to the mountains to get them into the ground, and then by helicopter stringing along the electrical wiring to provide those poor folks up there with electricity. It's an amazing challenge, and one that I think, again, would be helpful if you could tell us in some type of report of what we could do to better be prepared for the future. One of the things I'd also ask you to do for me, Brock, is I have a lot of attached housing where I live. I represent New York City, parts of New York City, and to mitigate for flood insurance, a lot of people that live in my district cannot raise their houses. So if FEMA could come up with some mitigators for those folks who can't raise their homes so that they can experience reductions in their flood insurance, that would be very helpful. And the last thing I'd like to speak about before my time runs out, I have constituents who took that responsibility you spoke about and are trying to get flood insurance, but they're not able to pay it in full at one time. And part of the Insurance Affordability Act of the Homeowner Flood Insurance Ability Act of 2014 created this system where people could pay by a payment plan. I have one particular woman who reached out to me, Camille Saul, who tried to do that, and the system's not in place yet. So if you could look into that for me, I very much appreciate it. Again, this woman and many people are trying to do the right thing, protect their properties by having national flood insurance, but can't pay it in full or in whole, and want to use this payment plan that we've put into place. And if you could look into that for me, I very much appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you.
All right, gentleman yields. Ms. Demings from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member and to our witnesses. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for all that you do to restore families after natural disasters. I grew up in Florida, still represent Florida, served as a first responder, and so I'm no stranger to hurricanes. Mr. Long, I do want to ask you, according to reports, FEMA has denied about 23% of the 2.9 million applications for individual assistance after Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, with the majority of those denials being in Florida. Several of my constituents report that their applications have been rejected for technicalities, typos, or an omitted document. Rather than a plain language request for additional information, they received a 4-page denial. My office had the opportunity to assist one of the families whose home was destroyed by patches of toxic mold covering every surface. But because they were missing one insurance form, they faced a termination of their transitional housing assistance. Now, fortunately, we were able to help them resubmit their application, and they qualified for an additional 18 months of continued rental assistance. So my question is, how does this denial rate compare to prior disasters, and what factors might explain the difference, if any?
So I don't know what where that rate compares, but I can tell you that the fundamental problem when it goes back to reducing the complexity of FEMA, one of the problems that we have is we immediately go out and say, call 1-800-621-FEMA. We blanket communities. And the problem that I have with that is that we need to change the dialogue on that. It needs to be call 1-800-621 if you meet this specific criteria to where aid can be rendered to begin with, because it sets up a negative relationship with the disaster survivor versus our agency right off the bat, and it leads to too many calls being rejected. Now, if your citizens are being not afforded individual assistance because of simple technicalities, I would like to work with you directly on what those technicalities are so that we can streamline, whether it's the way the website is designed to register systems, or maybe we got it wrong and I can refer you back to an IA case manager in the Joint Field Office in Florida. I'd be happy to do that. And we regularly have dialogue like that. And I do believe it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we leave no stone unturned when it comes to the citizens.
So would you say the process, if a person did not have all of the documentation that they needed, do you know if the process is an automatic denial at that point, or do you solicit additional information?
I wouldn't say it's a denial, but the problem is that people don't come prepared to the first phone call because we're not doing enough to say, when you call, make sure you have your insurance information, Social Security number, and in some cases, I think it's a messaging problem that we've got to get better at the first time, and then maybe they come back and then they're put in. But if there is a true fundamental flaw with the system and the way it's designed, then I'm all ears. I'd be happy to understand it and change.
Okay, thank you for that. And earlier you talked about Texas and it being a model, and I believe you said that, in order to appropriately respond, it has to be federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. Is that correct?
Right.
And as I mentioned in my opening statement, being no stranger to hurricanes in Florida, could you talk a little bit about the Florida response and perhaps we might be able to improve, and at which level?
So Governor Scott's done a tremendous job as well, and me calling out Texas specifically is no shot at Governor Scott by any means or any of the other governors. Florida is also a model. Florida's also been a gold standard as well. They're also flush with resources too. The thing about it is, what I appreciate is that when a governor takes over the response and the recovery, and provides me clear outcome goals of what they're striving for, then I can better the resources down to them from a financial standpoint or from physical resource standpoint. I would like FEMA to become more of a block granting agency to fund the response and allow the community to respond and recover the way they see fit. I don't know Florida better than you, ma'am. I don't know Florida better than Governor Scott. So how do I get the authorities and arrange the support down to where Florida can recover the way Florida wants to recover, Puerto Rico can recover the way Puerto Rico wants to recover? And it's my goal to provide technical expertise to Director Westmall, who's going to be testifying with you together to say, hey, here are some best practices. Here's the way to use this funding to ultimately create a more resilient Florida. I'm tired of going back into communities as an emergency manager and repeating this vicious cycle of things get blown out, we repair it. Things get blown out, we repair it. That's why I believe we have to also do more mitigation on the front end to prevent these things. The insurance gap is only growing. It's frustrating because when people are uninsured or let their insurance lapse, like what we saw in California, they paid off their mortgage, the fire comes in, burns down their house, they're trying to have a little extra money in retirement as a result, then that becomes an individual assistance problem. My individual assistance program grows daily. The need for FEMA is growing daily. I want it to go the opposite direction, but we can't do it alone.
Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields. Mr. Higgins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Long, for your continued service, and General Jackson as well. Mr. Kelly, thank you for being here today. I represent South Louisiana, gentlemen, and we are certainly well experienced regarding hurricanes and natural disasters and the recovery thereafter, preparation prior. My state provided support to Texas, pre-staging and rescue operations, sheltering prior to Harvey and in the wake of Harvey. I personally went into Texas immediately after Harvey on a Thursday morning and participated in rescue operations on the ground in Texas. And I'd like to talk about infrastructure challenges in the continental United States versus Puerto Rico. But regarding the process for reimbursement to the states for domestic response, Mr. Long, what do you believe is an acceptable time frame for reimbursement, and how can FEMA improve the process for reimbursement to states that at their own expense, sometimes tremendous expense, immediately participate in sheltering and rescue operations in the wake of a natural disaster?
So we've started to look at, and something that we've implemented kind of after post-Katrina, is expedited public assistance payments down, particularly if there's liquidity issues or issues to pay for the emergency services right off the bat, which I believe is a success. We need to continue to do it. Always we have to protect against waste or inaccurate funding and that type of thing.
Do you think the reimbursement process that we hope to improve would be included in your vision for reform and streamlining the operations, where greater availability of block grants to governors and give them the opportunity to make these decisions and be your filter, so we get FEMA out of it and allow the governors of the 50 sovereign states greater flexibility on how to respond quickly?
Absolutely. That's, and we have to do it. It would be a phased, delicate process to make sure that we're protecting the taxpaying dollar, but we're affording the governor to truly find ways to be resilient. I believe governors can do business quicker and more innovatively than the federal government.
I agree, and I support that effort and hope to be a part of a legislative effort to make that happen. General Jackson, regarding infrastructure post-storm, Houston, one of the most advanced cities in the nation, certainly by any measure, and yet in the city of Houston, both air traffic control towers at the two major airports in Houston were down after Harvey. And the first responders, of course, commercial traffic was shut down, but first responders, air traffic was handled through the Herman Memorial Hospital air traffic control tower they have a helipad, of course, at their airport. And it struck me as in the continental United States, the level of construction and infrastructure is quite different from, for instance, in Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico. And yet even in Texas, in Houston, the air traffic control towers were down immediately after Harvey for first responders to use. So regarding the standards for grid construction, for instance, in Puerto Rico, my understanding, my sources advised me that prior to the storm, approximately 20% of the grid was down in Puerto Rico. Is that correct?
Congressman, the grid had some significant deferred maintenance issues and some significant operability issues before Irma hit. Irma, when it came through, caused some damage to the grid. that wasn't fully repaired before Maria came in and further damaged the grid.
So your efforts in Puerto Rico, have you essentially established, restored the grid to its pre-storm performance?
Congressman, the Stafford Act allows us to restore the grid in its current configuration, but in fact, the grid in Puerto Rico is about 44 years old. The average grid in the rest of the United States is about 15 years old. So as we've gone and repaired the lines and the towers and all the components of the grid, and it's only transmission and distribution, we haven't been given any authority to work generation, other than temporary generation that we've used to augment repair operations. I mean, we're continuing to build that back, and it's going to be a much better grid than it was when we inherited it, just because of the state that it was in when we took over the restoration effort. So it's not changing in configuration. So we're not burying lines where lines were strung with transmission towers beforehand, but we are replacing what was damaged with modern equipment up to code. The Puerto Rican grid had about 15 different types of transformers. The industry standard is 4. And so as we've had to piece this back together, we've had to put different components back in the system, which is going to make it a more efficient system when we're done.
Thank you for your very thorough answer, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your service. This is titled Lessons Learned. Part of what I want to get into is that those lessons learned should be geared towards mitigation and prevention in the future of disasters. And in that case, I also want to associate myself with everything that's being said by the other members. But I want to gear in on my district in particular. It's probably the most coastal area. It's the South Shore, the South Coast, Cape Cod, and the islands. If it's not one of the biggest coastal areas, it's one of them. And I just want to address some of the important issues. And I think this boils down to we can't be expecting all of you to do more, and we're going to have to do more the way the cycle of climate change is going, with less. But in my district, there's some examples. We're doing a study, a 701 study on the Cape Cod Canal, vital safety area, navigation area in our area, that's just been so delayed. The bridge, we have 2 connectors to almost 300,000 people in Cape Cod area, only 2 bridges. And there's a study with that's just so delayed. It's ongoing but delayed, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is ready and willing to work with us, and that's holding things back. The potential for disaster is enormous. We have a nuclear plant rated one of the 3rd worst in terms of safety, built on the coast, a Fukushima-designed plant, yet those 2 bridges can cut off access to all those people if there's any kind of disaster. And on a daily basis, the dredging issues in our area are enormous, and that affects rescue missions and dealing with it. So I want to say just a couple of things. Number one, particularly General Jackson, we deal with the Army Corps daily in our area. The personnel there, the administration there, the communication is excellent. We work together. We strategize together. They do a great job. But again, the real issue, and when we talk to them, is we don't have enough money to do this. And there's no way to prioritize for everything that's of equal or greater need. And we have to do a job here. Now, I've helped with the appropriation process here, targeting in areas without earmarking. But we've been able to do that, work together. And I understand the constraints that all of you are sitting under if you have to comment about not being funded adequately, not just this administration, but administrations before, they don't encourage you to say you're not adequately funded. But the plain fact is you just can't do, and I think it's irrefutable, you just can't do all these things with less. So a couple of things. Number one, I'd ask you if you could, outside the hearing, in the next few weeks, maybe deal with our staff here on that end. We're dealing so well with your staff in the regional level, honestly, working these things out. And also, if you could, just comment generally, if you could, with the factor that not having enough resources to please everyone, without talking about budget numbers and getting yourself maybe compromised, how important that is, if you could.
Congressman, sure, I'll be glad to do that. First of all, you know, authorized but unconstructed projects that are in the Corps portfolio right now top $96 billion in FY16 numbers. But we are only able to generate about slightly over $1 billion every year in construction funding because there's not a limitless federal budget. I mean, there are a lot of demands. A lot of hard decisions have to be made. So, but that's just the fact of what we have to deal with every day. What we are doing is we're working very closely with the administration as they're putting forth their infrastructure package to the Congress. We've identified, you talked about the speed in which we operate. We've identified or helped to identify a number of legislative proposals that will help us move faster. We're working a number of proposals inside the administration to allow us to operate more quickly, and we're participating in all of the different initiatives that the administration put forth, specifically on regulatory streamlining, permit streamlining, environmental review streamlining. We're fully participative in all that as a whole of government, which allows us and all the other resource agencies that work together to be able to try to move faster than we have been able to in the past.
Well, I'll certainly work with you on that. My time is running out, but I would like to say on the flood insurance as well, we have questions outside of that where there's good bipartisan work being done, but Mr. Vaughn.
Yep. So we need a lot of work on the NFIP reauthorization. It's not a healthy program. We need to make it financially solvent, no doubt about it. In regards to funding, one thing I want to point out, though, is that the bread and butter of emergency management is the state and local levels of emergency management in government. It's not just whether or not FEMA's got enough money. It's our governors and state, and not even governors, state legislatures really taking a look as a result of going through this season and saying, does their state emergency management agency have what it needs? Do their local emergency management agencies have what they need? Because a majority of the events that the locals and states are going to face, FEMA's not going to be involved.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I would say in our state, we're doing a pretty good job in that regard. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I know Mr. Long has a hard stop at 12:30, so I'd ask the remainder of the questions to be kept within the time period. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rutherford from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Jackson, I represent the 3 coastal counties in northeast Florida, Nassau, Duval, and St. John's. And my question is beach renourishment and sand dune construction treated differently than other mitigation from storms?
Congressman, it's not treated any differently.
Okay. Because here's my question, and I was really glad to hear you say that we're looking for ways to speed the process up. Colonel Kirk has been great to work with, him and his personnel. But one of the issues that we're looking at, I have homes, one home that has literally already fallen into the ocean, and many more that in South Ponte Vedra Beach that are really on the edge of falling in, literally. I mean, they've already been undermined. And FDEP, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, is working closely with us. But an 18-month study seems like a long time when your house is hanging on the edge. And so my question is, are there other ways that we can get funding to the state now after they pick up their piece of it, as they should? Is there other ways that we can get that funding to them more quickly so that we can address these houses that are really on the verge?
Congressman, I can tell you right now, we're wide open to any ideas that you or your staff might have, as well as Florida and the state government there. We've been in a number of discussions with them about how to move faster. A lot of times the study process that you referred to that takes some period of time is driven by the environmental review process, which I think the administration has been looking at very closely to try to get done much more quickly and with less ability for other federal agencies to have long-standing decisions that cause us to redo different portions of it. So we're going to work really hard on that. I think the supplemental that the Congress passed has given us some broad discretion to take a look at areas that are either need to be studied, are being studied right now, or just need funding for nourishment. And they've been very specific about waiving 902 or the cost limits that have been imposed based upon the authorization. And also that when we do build the beaches back, that we build them to full design, full construction requirements. So I think there's a lot of great potential for the projects that you're talking about with the supplemental that Congress passed.
Thank you very much for that, and I look forward to working with you on that. Mr. Long, I have to tell you, as a first responder myself, I'm familiar with pre-positioning equipment and the mitigation after some of these horrible storms. And look, the last thing you want to do is pre-position your equipment on an island that's about to get hit by a Category 5 storm. So that's a bad idea. But I will tell you that there was some pre-positioning that went on of some goods that were pre-positioned in a city that I represent, Jacksonville, Florida. As you know, I think the American maritime industry did a fantastic job in response to Puerto Rico's needs. In fact, they had pre-positioned container units in Jacksonville that within days of the port opening, those goods were on the port, which actually allowed the mayor of San Juan to stand there and criticize the response with thousands of container units stacked up behind her. The challenge is most people know, and I'd like everyone to know, the challenge was distribution, and you mentioned that. The communications, the transportation, all of that got in the way of distribution of goods and services. And as somebody who's been responsible for that in the past, I understand completely what you all were facing. And so I would mention that, you know, the Jones Act was so politicized. There were folks on the news talking about how quickly the president suspended the Jones Act in Texas and how long it took for Puerto Rico. It was a one-day difference. I went back and checked. One-day difference. And in addition to that, so much misinformation about the Jones Act and the cost of goods and services. And folks were actually improperly describing how the Jones Act even works, talking about, I heard an individual in Jacksonville on the news talking about the reason it costs so much is because foreign vessels have to sail into an American port, drop those goods off, and then reload those goods onto an American flag ship and sail it down to San Juan. Wrong. Those foreign ships can sail directly into San Juan, and they do all the time. And so, you know, there was a lot of politicization of what was going on down there. But I would like to ask one thing about the contract issue. Would it help if we created a database of these bad actors through these contracts?
Well, I believe that the database and the system exists. It just wasn't put in prior to us reaching out.
Oh, okay.
And there was a resource drain. But one thing I'd like to follow up on regarding distribution and commodities, this is the story that's not being told. As I said, we've hired approximately 1,300 Puerto Ricans to be part of the response and recovery and the future arm of emergency management. What we're doing to prepare for the 2018 hurricane season is now we're starting to build a true network of emergency management at the Commonwealth and local level that did not exist, in my opinion. And so what we're doing is we've planned a series of training and exercises that are going to culminate in a full-scale exercise in this coming June with the governor, with the mayors, specifically designed around the distribution of commodities, and we're also reconfiguring some contracts. You don't just execute a contract and the ship shows up immediately. It takes 7-8 days to fully execute the comfort in motion or different and ships like that. So we're doing a tremendous amount of work that's not being talked about, and it's not FEMA doing it for Puerto Rico and the Commonwealth. It is we're working with the Commonwealth to make sure that they will have the state level and local level capability to manage this disaster in the future so that we reduce our footprint in that manner.
Thank you. I have several other questions, but my time is up, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the panel here today. Thank you very much for your testimony. Let me start with Administrator Long and General Jackson. Climate change continues to increase the incidence of major storms and flooding, especially threatening the lives and livelihoods of residents in coastal states like my home state of Rhode Island. Administrator Long and General Jackson, what steps are FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers taking to prepare coastal communities like mine for this increased risk and to mitigate the damage of future disasters?
So I'll start. There are provisions in mitigation planning, so we require states and local governments to have mitigation plans. They're signed off on by FEMA, just kind of your understanding of how you want to mitigate for future disasters. There are sea level rise provisions that are in those mitigation standards that are there. The problem goes back to you got to get hit with a disaster to be able to execute your mitigation plan if you want FEMA mitigation funding. So the problem we have to solve, in my opinion, is we've got to get the pre-disaster mitigation up front so that people can execute those mitigation plans before the disaster occurs or things like sea level rise start to occur.
Hey, Congressman, after Superstorm Sandy, the Corps worked with all the states in the northeastern part of the United States and also with experts around the world to identify coastal risk and published a North Atlantic Coastal Comprehensive Study, which identified a lot of different risk areas and identified things that the federal government, the states, and the localities could do to address just what you've talked about. And so we're in the process right now of working with all the states on the northeast side that were impacted by Sandy to try and address those mitigation measures and lower the risks to the communities that are on the coastline. With the Corps, we incorporate everything that we know about climate change and sea level rise in our designs. And so as we conduct studies on coastal resilience in areas that we know have significant risk, we incorporate everything that we know about that, and those are implemented into our design standards when we put those projects forward to the Congress for authorization.
I think it's essential that we be as forward-leaning, as forward-thinking as we can on this issue, preparing for climate change, because it is here, and what we can do to mitigate it's going to make everyone better off in the long run. That's another probably a whole another discussion about what we really need to do long term to reverse the effects of climate change. But let me start this. Natural disasters like hurricanes and floods and fires that we saw in 2017 certainly were devastating to countless people and communities in their path. For individuals with critical health conditions or disabilities, these effects are magnified, sometimes significantly, despite requirements that disaster planning consider and include accommodations for individuals who require accessible modes of communication or transportation, medical devices, or other types of assistance. Too many, we found, are left to fend for themselves when catastrophe strikes. So, Administrator Long, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of learning lessons about meeting the needs of survivors with access and functional needs. What lessons have FEMA and its partners learned from last year's disasters? What changes have been made to procedural guidance, and how are these recommendations monitored for compliance and implementation to ensure that people with disabilities are carefully considered in disaster planning, response, and recovery?
Well, first of all, I believe as a nation, not just FEMA, but all entities need to bake in inclusion and functional and access needs as to part of their DNA every day. I can't force a city to be ADA compliant, but what I can do is start to organize recovery dollars that go into communities after the fact, or mitigation dollars to help communities and emergency managers achieve a higher level of functional and access needs. Most recently, I hired a lady by the name of Linda Mastandria, who is now FEMA's Office of Disability Integration Coordination. I've asked her to go out to understand and work across the lines with FEMA Recovery Office to say, look, when all of this funding comes down, how do we actually help these communities improve facilities in a manner that become more functional and access needs compliant to ensure inclusion, not only through the future of the infrastructure that's built, but also within our shelters. We have a lot of work to do as a nation, but here again, this problem is far greater than FEMA, but we're working to address it every day. I'd be happy to set you up with Linda Mastandria. She's phenomenal. She's right now, was most recently in South Korea. She's a Paralympian that's won, I think, 15 gold medals. And phenomenal lady. She's also a lawyer, so she's very, very well versed, and I think you're going to see some changes in the way we handle functional and access needs.
Well, thank you. I look forward to that meeting and I'd like to further continue our discussion on this topic. I have several more, but my time's expired. I'll yield back at this point, but I look forward to submitting my questions for the record, and hopefully you can get back to me as soon as possible on these, and then I look forward to a continued discussion on this important topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all three of you for your leadership. You were put in a very tough situation with a terrible hurricane, the airport down, the roads, the power. I mean, what a challenge. So I know you've been working this very hard. My first question is for Administrator Long and General Jackson. What would be the criteria for considering mission complete?
We're still there. We're going to be there for years.
Be there for years.
Yeah, I mean, it's too early to grade myself or say mission complete. Bottom line is we're going to be administering dollars to help these communities overcome for years. And the one thing that I think that we're missing here is that there weren't just 4 events last year. Right now, I'm working in 14. My staff is diligently working in 14 different states. Mm-hmm. Last year, we picked up a new event every 3 days. Every 3 days.
But just to clarify, you think you'll be in Puerto Rico for years?
Absolutely.
Okay, got it.
Absolutely.
General Jackson, anything else with that?
Congressman, I mean, we are in Puerto Rico now. I have an area office there. We have federal projects there. We work with the government there on a daily basis. So we'll always be in Puerto Rico, and we'll be supporting FEMA as long as Mr. Long has mission assignments for us to follow up on.
If I may ask you both, what would be the largest unexpected challenge that you had in Puerto Rico? Is there one thing that took you the most surprise?
Getting the power back on solves so many problems. Bottom line is, that was the toughest challenge. I do not control an aging system. I do not control deferred maintenance on a power grid. I have to fix what I've inherited, and we rapidly put forward the mission assignment to the Army Corps of Engineers, and this is the only situation where the Army Corps of Engineers is rebuilding the grid. We've got to get to a model to where the grid is rebuilt by private industry, in my opinion, similar to the way it was done in California, Texas, and Florida.
How has the bankruptcy of PREPA impacted the recovery efforts?
The liquidity efforts, or the liquidity issues as a whole, are very difficult. It compromises simple things such as EMAC agreements. People demand 100% right off the bat to do work when you bring in private contractors or other support for fear that they may not be repaid. And we're working very closely with Governor Rosselló, working very closely with the Treasury to make sure that we solve some of these problems so that the response and recovery doesn't slow down.
Okay. One final question for General Jackson. What regulatory relief is necessary to help you speed up these kind of efforts? Is there something we can do to pull some of the regulatory problems off your shullders?
Congressman, I think the administration's already taken a look at that, and they're really looking at how to streamline all environmental reviews that ultimately result in permitting and other things that we're involved with. So I think we're well on track, and everybody's been participating fully in that effort.
Okay. Knowing that your time's short, I will yield back. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Bonnie Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Long, hi. More than a decade after Hurricane Katrina, your office is still involved in audit disputes, including efforts to get a $2 billion settlement with roads and infrastructure of the city overturned. Do you think that there is a limit on how long after an event audits should last? Is it an inefficient use of resources to Monday morning quarterback in years-long audits more than a decade later? Are the communities affected this summer going to face decades of audits and no relief?
Well, I think we have to follow out the process, and the process that's put in place is just for due diligence purposes. We have to follow out the process. But when there are audits in question, and I've seen this as a former director of the Alabama Emergency Management Agency, when there are de-obligations in question or audits in question where there are large amounts of money looming over a community's that may be deobligated, then it can impact their credit ratings going forward. So I do think that we have to move quickly to make sure things like that don't occur. We have to move expeditiously, but I would also...
Well, do you agree, sir, that 2 years is not moving expeditiously, that it is too long? And is FEMA doing anything to sort of...
which situation are you specifically referring to?
I'm talking about Katrina. That's what I was asking you about.
For Katrina?
The $2 billion dispute that's been an audit for 2 years?
I would have to get back, or we would have to work with you. I'm
Yeah.
not sure which one it is, unless I could defer to Mr. Kelly.
Is it the water and sewer audit?
Yes.
Okay.
Listen, may we have a specific update on why this is taking so long, what is being done, why are you lacking the resources to respond to it after 2 years, and when can we expect relief here? Mr. Long, can we get that?
Yes, absolutely, but I would also refer to Mr. Kelly with OIG.
Yes, and that audit was initiated and completed within roughly a year of the additional obligations for that water and sewer project.
Yeah.
Very little was done immediately after Katrina. The Inspector General's office has changed its style of auditing. We try to be more proactive and much closer to when the money's being spent, not 10 years after.
So, you know, this is all good, you know, hypothetically, conceptually, and all that kind of stuff. We're talking about communities that are ravaged, people who have been displaced, people who can't get jobs, people who become ill because of these terrible hurricanes. I mean, look at what's happened in both the Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico. For the life of me, and Mr. Long, maybe you can answer this question. With all the resources, with all the armed forces, with all the rescue, emergency, and whatever else there is that this great country, the United States of America, has at its disposal, if you can't get up a road to deliver supplies vitally needed for people to live, why couldn't you airlift them in or do something else? Why was that situation so inadequately addressed, and why is it still so inadequately addressed?
First of all, man, with all due respect, I believe we live in the greatest country on the globe, and the amount of resources...
I never suggested we didn't, sir.
Yep, but the amount of resources that the federal government put down, the amount of resources that state governments, the lengths to which our government goes to help disaster victims can always be improved, but it is unmatched. It is second to none in any other country on the globe. We put people in hotels for months.
You know what? I don't need you to make excuses. I need you to tell me why you failed there.
We haven't failed, ma'am.
Yes, you did.
No, we did not. The bottom line is my agency made a Herculean effort to put food and water in every area, and it's more complex and it's not going to move as fast. When you're talking about island jurisdictions and the airport systems are completely blown out, the ports are completely blown out, I don't own the cranes. I don't own the airports. We have to rebuild airports. We move rapidly.
You have collaborative capacity, and that collaborative capacity did not serve the citizens of Puerto Rico well. And so my concern, it is not just you, sir. It is why did the United States of America, with all of its vast resources, not do its very best for people who are indeed our people? With that, I yield back.
The administrator has very limited time, so I'm going to recognize the three. But if you could keep your questions within a short period of time, it would be very much appreciated. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first of all thank the people from the Army Corps of Engineers and the people from FEMA for all the hard work they've been doing in the island. We acknowledge that. Although we still know that there's a lot to do still, I want to thank you for your being always available for calls, for meetings with mayors, and for all the people in the island. I really do that personally because I've been calling you mostly every day to ask you about different issues. My first question will be, what resources will be necessary to you to finish the work in 30 days? I'm talking to the Corps of Engineers in terms of the restoration of the power.
Ma'am, we have the materials that we need to finish that are on order, and they're either in transit or they're on the island right now, ready for distribution to contractors. So, and they will be continuing to flow onto the island until the end of April. And so until we get everything on the ground, I mean, that's a physics problem. Everything had to come off production lines. We had to special order material to meet the unique specifications of the power grid. You know, we have enough linemen on the ground to do the work that needs to be done. It's just a matter of them working through and energizing the lines and getting the pieces and parts put back together. So there's really no other resources that we need that I can think of. Everything that we've asked for, that we've needed to do this mission, we've been provided. And it's just a matter of having to put the physics of putting together a very complicated system that's going to take us some time to finish.
My concern with that is that you are downsizing the group of the crew of your private contractors on the island. One is going to be gone from the island the 19th of March and the other one on the 7th of April. So that means that the resources are not going to be there to help us out to finish the last mile of the process. So how the island is going to feel that their issues are going to be solved in terms of the connection of those center part of the island when you are downsizing the Army Corps presence through those areas. That's my main concern. And don't say that PREPA is going to take charge of that, because it will take a month or month and a half for them to do the contracting process with the memorandum of understanding with other utilities in the states.
Ma'am, you know, when we originally asked to do this, there were no mutual assistance workers available. Now there are almost 1,000 mutual assistance workers. I know the numbers go up and down based upon how they get recalled back to their states. But Mr. Torres and the team, the Unified Command Group, look at the numbers of line workers that are required to do the missions based upon what's left to be completed. They look at that every single day. And there's decisions that are made. FEMA, the government of Puerto Rico, and the Corps of Engineers are all involved with making. And it could be that you know, the one company that we have that's going to be done in April, maybe they get extended a little bit longer. We're looking at all those things every single day to make sure that the progress of the work that we have in front of us to finish is not impacted at all by a lack of people. There is no lack of people, even though we're downsizing the big contracts that we awarded in October. It's only because the numbers that we have there aren't needed anymore, and they've been replaced by mutual assistance workers who should have been there in the first place. And so that's not the changing of who and is doing the work is not impacting our ability to get the overall grid restored as fast as we can get it restored.
I just urge you to reconsider the downsizing of the Army Corps on the island. I do think that we don't have enough personnel to do that kind of work, and it will take longer to the recovery processes in those areas just because of the downsizing. I should recommend extend the current contracts until the time the PREPA or the Mutual Alliance linemen will be arriving on the island. Remember that last weeks ago, the winter storm just took away 68 of those linemen to New York and Pennsylvania. So we can't continue to be waiting for personnel to arrive on the island.
I mean, we're not waiting. We have everybody's there. They're going to be different people. They're not, and in some cases, it's the same subcontractors that are working for different contractors. So there's, you know, PREPA has about 2,200 line workers on the ground now, which includes 4 different, I mean, their own organic workwork and 3 other subcontractors that are doing work.
Thank you, Mr.
Delaney's
Chairman.
time's expired. I just, for the last 2 members, we're about 20 minutes past the administrator's hard stop, so if you could keep your time at a minimum. Ms. Velasquez is recognized.
I will make it simple, Mr. Chairman. If I could send you, Mr. Long, some of my questions so that you can send them your answers to my office. General Jackson, I hear what you're saying to the Congress lady from Puerto Rico, gentle lady from Puerto Rico, you're downsizing and you are allowing for PREPA to continue to do the work with some of the subcontractors that they have. Do you think that will PREPA, given the conditions of PREPA itself, should that provide any comfort to the people of Yabucoa, my hometown, where Hurricane Maria made landfall, and to this day, they have no electricity?
Congresswoman, as we discussed yesterday, I'm confident only because the experts that are making the decisions on how we determine how we apportion the workforce are fully confident that, based upon demonstrated capability, that the line workers that are there, both from PREPA's organic workforce and from the subcontractors that they have, are more than capable of doing the work and are continuing to demonstrate their ability to do that.
And why is that being the town where Maria made landfall, that 6 months later, what is it about Yabucoa?
Congressman, I think Yabucoa's biggest problem is it was the point of impact and it had sustained the greatest damage. And so the most work is being done right there.
I've been there 4 times. I never saw any crew until just my last visit. In any case, General Jackson, I really want to thank you for getting back to me yesterday in our telephone call, where I raised some of the issues that the people of Vieques are facing today. My question to you is regarding Puerto Rico's preparedness for the upcoming hurricane season, particularly in the area of energy. It seems to me that no matter how much money we put into the reconstruction of the grid, unless we ensure the entire grid is strengthened to withstand Category 4 or 5, we are just throwing money away. Can you comment on the repair work being done so far?
Congresswoman, I'd be glad to do that. I mean, the mission that we were given was to restore the power and get people the lights back on as fast as possible. So that's what we're doing. What you're describing is a more long-term goal that we're working on. We're working as part of FEMA's team, as part of the governor's team, to help the governor develop a long-term recovery strategy, which is going to take into account all the things that you discussed, which would be things like taking the power generation capabilities, making them more modernized, putting them more closer to where the population centers are, which allows us to more economically bury lines where now, as Administrator Long talked about, these lines crisscross the island, and that's what the power distribution and transmission system is based upon. So that's in the works right now, and that will be presented to the administration sometime at the end of the summer.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, this week, Puerto Rico is actively pursuing a policy that will weaken the Puerto Rico Energy Commission, an effort that will severely undermine generally accepted regulatory and accountability practices. As the Inspector General, can you provide us some detail in the importance of oversight of government institutions? If this type of entity is weakened, how do we ensure good stewardship of taxpayers' funds?
Ma'am, that's going to be very difficult to do if you reduce oversight, especially on an organization that has known risks. That is a recipe for disaster.
Thank you.
General Ladies, time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for this. I'm going to have as well try and bring a bunch of questions in writing, which I hope that you will respond to as quickly as possible. I know that with bureaucracy can take some time, but the faster these answers come back to us, the better, I think, for everyone. And Administrator Long, one of the things that I brought up in the opening statement, and I'm hoping you can give me some definition for, is who is responsible and what is the timeline for the modular units that are going to the schools as well as to the hospitals in the Virgin Islands?
So ultimately, in my opinion, the governor, of the Virgin Islands, Governor Mapp, is responsible. It's my job to make sure that he has the mechanisms and the funding to do so, and we're working very closely with him. But I'd be happy to respond in
I would
writing
appreciate
about
that,
the whole entire process.
Because it seems like a circular discussion. Department of Education says they're waiting for FEMA. FEMA says they're waiting for this. And so the people want to know who it is, so I
Absolutely.
appreciate that. In terms of the discussion about full federal cost share, you have received the request. I know the White House has received the request. Do we know when there will be an answer as to whether or not the Virgin Islands will receive an extension of time for full cost share for debris removal?
I do not know. Obviously, I don't control the White House, but I can obviously reach out to them as well to see where we are in queue.
I wanted to know if you were aware, however, that under the Insular Area Acts, all federal agencies have the discretion to waive local match for insular areas, defined to include the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico for federal funding programs. Has FEMA sought to exercise this express statutory discretion to waive the local match for all disaster funding for the U.S. Virgin Islands?
I believe that that's a request that's got to come in from the governor, and I'm not sure that we've received any request to do so. If so, I'll go back and check.
Okay. And the reason I'm asking this is, of course, that, the insular areas have long had underfunding and under-inclusion across a litany of programs. And when you're facing a disaster such as this, that kind of express statutory discretion that you have would seem to be the appropriate time to do so. And, this is again, what you just said was something that, again, I brought up in my opening statement, is that you're waiting for a request from Governor Mapp. And oftentimes, I'm not sure if governors and other individuals in these areas know that they can make these specific requests. And the tension between FEMA and the local agencies are such that you wonder, our governor is spending money on having outside consultants come and consult him about what is he supposed to be requesting. And it seems that it's not the most efficient use of funding.
Congresswoman, so, my approach is, in my FCOs, who play an incredibly important role, I have asked them, and in their training, their sole purpose is to go out and say, Governor, this is what you're entitled to, this is based on this event. And if they're not doing that, then that's on me. I can go back and check.
Right.
But we never hold back things. It's our job to administer the Stafford Act and the policies that are out there. We have no reason to hold anything back. FEMA is not the enemy of a governor or of the disaster survivor.
Well, under FEMA, just that last question, and when you mentioned the Stafford Act, what is your position, and do you have would you support an extension of the FEMA, of Stafford Act language, so that it is not only bringing resilience to those things that are considered emergency, which is defined as power, water, communications, and education, but would also extend to other public assistance projects such as roads and public housing?
I'm not sure I understand the question, because we do fix roads and
No. So what I'm
housing
asking
under
is
emergency provision.
an amendment to the Stafford Act, which would provide for embedding resilience. The resilience that you are now going to bring to areas such as power and water and communications
Right.
does not extend necessarily to roads and public housing.
Right.
Would you be in favor or supportive of an amendment that addresses that in the Stafford Act to bring that as well? And I'll
I'm
go
all
back
for
to
resilience. Let me be honest. I'm all for resilience because I want to reduce the job. I mean, we need to work FEMA out of a job over, through resilience and mitigation. I believe that the 428 program, which is something that's on the table with the governor as well, allows for more alternative projects and resilience projects to be built in. The Stafford Act may allow us to do that for the roadway systems, but that's a conversation that we can have offline as well if you'd like, and I can explain that.
General Lady's time's expired.
Mr.
I want
Chairman,
to thank the
Mr.
witnesses.
Chairman, I'd like to put 3 questions on the record for Mr. Brock Long to hear.
Okay.
I'll be very asked unanimous consent. Mr. Brock, as it relates to Houston and Texas, answer directly to me, writing and by phone, on the FEMA denials and whether or not you will automatically extend those who are in the hotels. The importance of working with local government, that's a difficulty. I know that you, by the Stafford Act, you work with the state. The local governments are really on the ground working with the day-to-day complaints. And then I think one of the solutions to these large contracts that you have that have not been helpful to us is contracting with local entities. Sometimes the entire region is not devastated. There are local contractors that can do a very important job, housing, food services, obviously debris, we know about that. But I think it's important for FEMA to look counseling, casework, can be done by local entities, and I'd like to reach back to you on those questions. And thank you for having your staff be at my meeting on March 5th. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses for your patience. I know this went well over schedule, but you stood by and answered all of our questions. I appreciate that very much. I'd just like also to say that Major General Jackson, I look forward to working with you on the reservoir project, and to Administrator Long. The first bill I got passed in the Congress was a FEMA reform bill after Katrina. And so I think there'll be some great lessons learned from this, things that we can work together to make it more streamlined, effective, and efficient. And I want to thank you and commend you for the job that you're doing right now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We're going to take a brief break, and the second panel will be joining us.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good job.
We're pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. Thanks for your patience. I know it's getting late. I think we have a subcommittee hearing it too here. Our second panel includes Mr. Reed Clay, Chief Operating Officer of the Office of Governor of the state of Texas. Great state of Texas. Mr. Wesley Mowell, Director of Division of Emergency Management for the state of Florida. And finally, the Honorable Joseph E. Menendez-Ortiz, Vice Chairman of the Committee on Federal and International Relations and Status for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and Ms. Janame Demaray, Senior Director of Save the Children. Thank you all for being here today, and I guess we'll start with Mr. Clay.
Good afternoon. Chairman Mccaul, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for holding this important hearing and for the opportunity to share lessons that we've learned from Hurricane Harvey in Texas. Let me quickly offer 3 key messages. The first is thank you for your partnership. Governor Abbott and the state of Texas are grateful for the strong partnership that we've shared with our federal counterparts to date. President Donald Trump, Vice President Pence, multiple members of the President's cabinet, and FEMA Administrator Brock Long showed their commitment to Texas even before the storm made landfall. They pledged their full resources and continue to show their commitment to the state to this day. Of course, Congress, too, deserves our deepest gratitude. Within days of Harvey's dissipation, as Texans had only begun to understand the magnitude of devastation, Congress moved quickly to appropriate needed financial assistance to quickly begin the rebuilding process. That hard work continued in the passage of additional appropriation bills that will help Texas recover and rebuild. And I wouldn't be a proud Texan if I didn't pay particular thanks to the Texas delegation. Chairman Mccaul, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, and the entire Texas delegation have been true champions for their constituents and for all Texans. Thank you. Next, let me share a couple lessons we have learned. The first lesson is that disaster recovery could be substantially improved by drastically cutting regulations and red tape at all levels of government. When it comes to disaster response, we must be outcome-focused, not process-oriented. Rest assured, Texas has done its part. Governor Abbott has used his emergency authorities to waive hundreds of regulations. Employing a similar outlook, Commissioner John Sharp, who leads the Governor's Commission to Rebuild Texas, has consistently found ways to push past bureaucratic barriers. But there's more to do. Beginning next week, the Commission to Rebuild Texas and the Texas Department of Emergency Management will hold a series of workshops to develop lessons learned and to focus on how best to restore, redevelop, and rebuild a more resilient Texas. These listen and learn sessions will inform a comprehensive report delivered by the Commission outlining changes that the state must make. But federal regulations also pose a problem. Because disaster recovery is administered across multiple agencies amid multiple layers of government, recovery is saddled by a redundancy of government. The federal government has opportunities to simplify the process, and it must be streamlined. Too often, individuals are passed between several agencies with different paperwork and different rules. Disaster response and recovery, as Administrator Long said earlier, is best when executed at a local level, but under the current process, local governments are buried under layers of government regulations, and disaster response and recovery cannot truly be executed at the local level if it is micromanaged in Washington. The second lesson is that we must rebuild Texas stronger. We now know Harvey was the biggest tropical cyclone rainfall event in U.S. history. Peak rainfall measured over 60 inches, with much of the area receiving more than 3 feet. The amount of rain was literally off the charts. This was not a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood. This was a 1,000-year flood. It was so much rain that the National Weather Service added additional colors to their rainfall charts to show just how much rain was falling in Texas. Not surprisingly then, Harvey is already the second costliest storm in U.S. history. The National Hurricane Center estimates more than $125 billion in losses, and it's reported that only $30 billion of that is insured, meaning Harvey will be by far the largest uninsured loss of 2017. If Harvey teaches us anything, it is surely that we must invest now to mitigate against losses from future storms that history tells us will happen again and again and again. Texas is already deploying hazard mitigation funds made available under the Stafford Act to undertake valuable mitigation projects through the affected region. The governor today will be in Houston announcing the first 3 projects later today.
But many of the projects needed to truly future-proof the affected area will require further federal assistance. Much of the damage in the affected areas could have been prevented or mitigated by federal projects that have been considered for years, or in some cases, decades. If there is only one lesson to be learned from Harvey, it is this: we must rebuild stronger to future-proof our valuable assets, human, natural, and economic, from future disasters. Let me close with this. The pace of recovery is never fast enough, and if the numbers I cited above are any indication, this will be Texas' longest and hardest rebuilding effort yet. We are grateful for the strong partnership with our federal partners thus far, but we also recognize that a recovery of this size will require the continued commitment of resources from our federal partners for months to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me just say, I think the governor made us all Texas proud and strong. So thanks for your testimony. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mccaul for his testimony.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. At 9:10 a.m. on September 10th, 2017, Hurricane Irma made landfall at Cujo Key as a Category 4 storm, becoming the first major hurricane to impact Florida since Wilma in 2005. Hurricane Irma's constantly changing course and intensity required the state emergency response team to plan for dozens of impact scenarios and resulted in one of the largest storm responses in Florida's history. Record-breaking evacuations, shelter populations, commodity distribution, mission requests, and quite possibly the largest power restoration in American history. The success of our state's response would not have been possible without the steadfast support of our mutual aid and EMAC partners. In the end, 38 states and the District of Columbia aided our efforts, either through dedicated teams or through resources shipped. Additionally, the military's contributions to Florida's response cannot be understated. Strategic partnerships with the National Guard and DoD proved to be the game-changing element in our response. It is important to remember that Hurricane Irma was not the only challenge we faced in 2017. Irma's impacts came just 2 weeks after Hurricane Harvey caused catastrophic damage in Texas. 10 days after Irma made landfall in Florida, Hurricane Maria impacted Puerto Rico, devastating the island. Nate was not far behind, impacting the Gulf Coast on October 7th. Despite the effects of one of the largest storms to hit our shores in over a decade, Florida stood ready to support. In support of Texas's efforts associated with Hurricane Harvey, the division coordinated the deployment of 3 search and rescue teams and a voluntary agency liaison. To prepare for the Gulf Coast impacts associated with Hurricane Nate, we pre-staged an IMT, and we made sure that ambulance, swiftwater rescue, recon, and USAR teams were on standby. The aftermath of Hurricane Maria's devastating landfall in Puerto Rico presented a unique set of challenges for those affected by the storm. However, Florida once again stood ready to help our neighbors. We fulfilled critical EMAC missions, requests for law enforcement, National Guard, transportation, and utility professionals in support of the response effort. Division staff worked closely with their Puerto Rico counterparts and members of Governor Rosella's administration to provide technical and strategic expertise, as well as information regarding the availability of Florida-based resources. Florida remains the only state to have entered into a host state agreement to directly assist Maria survivors. This helped us coordinate the opening of resource centers to provide tens of thousands of Maria evacuees in Florida with a one-stop shop for available survivor resources. At the request of Governor Scott, the Disaster Case Management Program was also approved for Maria evacuees in our state. This, when considered alongside TSA and the MARCs, proves Florida's commitment to providing every storm survivor with the same level of care, regardless of their origin. The 2017 Atlantic hurricane season was a defining event for the division and our partners. We will continue to review and reflect upon the actions taken during our many response operations, seeking ways to improve our practices and provide Floridians with the best possible quality of service. As we chart the course forward, Florida must strategically position itself to build a culture of preparedness, ready our communities for catastrophic disasters, and reduce the complexity of disaster programming. The 2017 season was the most expensive in U.S. history. FEMA Administrator Brock Long said that if this is the new normal, Americans can't rely on a federal cavalry when disaster strikes. They will need to have to take care of themselves. In Florida, we couldn't agree more. As emergency managers, we are taught that disasters are inherently local, and we recognize that until we return to a culture of localized responsibility, we will never truly be prepared for all disasters. To that end, there are things we can do now, together, to ensure that we are ready for whatever the future may hold. Let's streamline our policies and our procedures at every level. The last thing a storm survivor needs to deal with in the aftermath of a devastating impact is another bureaucratic maze. We can partner to train and mitigate on the front end, thus buying down the cost of disasters. Maximizing resiliency prior to emergencies will always prove more cost-effective than even the best of recoveries. Let's plan and fund strategies that are federally supported, state-managed, and locally executed. For example, increasing management costs to 12% would better position states and communities to manage disasters on their own while decreasing their overall dependency on federal resources. Administrator Long was correct in his statement. Building a culture of preparedness will be the most effective way to deal with the new normal. It's time to be bold and hit the reset button on much of what we thought we knew in this profession. Moving forward, I want this committee to know that my team and I are available to discuss with, partner on, and work with you on all issues. We also stand ready to work alongside Administrator Long and our fellow states to move this profession forward. I want to close by saying thank you to our federal, state, and local partners. It was a pleasure working with you last season, and we appreciate all of your hard work. You contributed to our success, which in turn allowed us to support our neighbors when they needed it the most. That's exactly how this business is supposed to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Melendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for the opportunity to appear before this committee today. Before I begin, I wish to extend our deepest gratitude for your dedicated support in assisting us in the process of recovery and rebuilding. I also want to thank you for your unconditional assistance to our sole representative in Congress, our champion and my friend, the Honorable Jennifer Gonzalez. It has been 6 months since Hurricane Irma pummeled through the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, and 176 days since Hurricane Maria ripped through our island. With a span of 2 weeks, Puerto Rico was hit by 2 Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. For the past 20 years, since Hurricane Georges, we had been spared, and up until September of last year, we often boasted that Puerto Rico was especially blessed and protected. And then we were humbled. On September 2017, we were facing one of the worst natural disasters in modern history. It was as if Mother Nature was reminding us all that no matter how strong one might be, nature will always be more powerful, and it deserves our utmost respect. That, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, is our first lesson. Let's be honest, none of us, either at the state or federal levels, were prepared to tackle the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria. This is our second lesson. We must make the necessary adjustments to adapt our emergency preparedness and recovery efforts for a more effective and efficient response in the upcoming hurricane season. To do this, at the federal level, a series of important items must be taken into consideration. Number one, the federal government must anticipate shipping delays to the island and take the necessary steps to ensure rapid response by sea and air. Number two, nowadays, telecommunications are a basic necessity. Your smartphone is no longer a luxury. It is a piece of emergency equipment that needs to function in order for the most basic communication to flow. Number three, cut the red tape. Whoever thought that bureaucracy could effectively handle emergencies was sorely mistaken. It can, despite all good intentions. Number four, there is no space for political pandering in the middle of an emergency. To use the pain and suffering of millions of American citizens to indulge in cheap politicking and gain political recognition is simply immoral. It is a shameful exploitation of people who are merely trying to recoup their normalcy in the midst of chaos. Number five, and this is important, we must urgently invest in strengthening our power grid. You know, the recently approved relief package included $16 billion for Puerto Rico. The funds are badly needed, as Puerto Rico simply lacks the resources, human or financial, to fortify the system and prepare for hurricane season. The simple truth is that we need more time. We need more time, more materials, more resources. It pains me to say, but we need more sense of urgency. So it is with this deep respect that I ask you as members of Congress, inject that much needed sense of urgency to our federal agencies. I make this humble request on behalf of the millions of families who, in the face of adversity, rose up the day after the storm to clean their houses, clean their debris from the streets, and help those in most need in their communities. I make this request on behalf of the thousands of doctors who have continued to tend to the sick in spite of the lack of power or internet in their offices or hospitals. I make this request on behalf of the thousands of entrepreneurs who have invested every single penny they have in the bank to save their businesses and open their doors to the public. They rose in spite of adversity. I make this request on behalf of the thousands of people who lost their jobs in the aftermath but have not quit and continue to look for work in order to get ahead. I make this request on behalf of the thousands of kids who go to school every day in spite of the lack of power or water. Their education continues to be more important than any obstacle. Because you see, behind the devastation of Maria, a bigger story is being written in Puerto Rico. It is a story of resilience. It is a story of people who want to get ahead, who want to be self-sufficient, who want to get back to normal. With that, I thank you for your time, and I hope that we can continue to work in together so we can build a stronger and better Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Chair recognizes Ms. Desmarais.
Sorry about that. Chairman Mccaul, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, I'm Jeanne Desmarais, the Senior Director of U.S. Emergencies for Save the Children. Since Katrina in 2005, I've led our response to every natural disaster and man-made disaster in the U.S., and I've had the honor of serving on FEMA's National Advisory Council, and I currently serve on FEMA's IPAWS subcommittee of the NAC. On behalf of Save the Children, thank you for this opportunity to really highlight the needs of children and the lessons learned across all three disasters. I'd be remiss if I also, though, didn't thank Ranking Member Thompson, Congressman Donovan, Congressman Payne, for your leadership in introducing and helping pass the Homeland Security Act for Children through the House. This legislation will go a long way to help children in emergencies and hopefully will help fill some of the gaps that I'm going to highlight today. So Save the Children has been working for more than 100 years to support children in crisis and emergencies in the U.S. and around the world. Through our on-the-ground work during the 3 hurricanes, we've identified critical gaps. We keep seeing these gaps again and again in emergencies, and we seek to partner with Congress to help really close these gaps to better protect and support children. The 3 hurricanes, as we've heard, had a massive impact on infrastructure, but it had a massive, even greater impact on children's lives across all 3 disasters. Save the Children continues to work on the long-term recovery in each of the 3 areas, helping rebuild schools, helping rebuild child care programs, after-school programs, and helping deliver mental health and psychosocial recovery programs for children, which is the most profound gap that we have seen across all 3 emergencies. In Puerto Rico specifically, the estimates are that it's going to take more than 10 years for the overall recovery. We've heard that from many of the experts. We continue to hear that many schools have lacked electricity and lacked running water, lacked drinking water. Imagine trying to conduct school for hundreds of children each day without power in the classrooms, without access to learning laboratories, without access to regular support. So children in Puerto Rico have missed hundreds and hundreds of hours of learning, and many of the most vulnerable children will not ever catch up because of the months of school that they've had decreased opportunities for learning. So while there are many visible indications of damage to structures, outdoor spaces, recreational equipment, there's also this profound impact on and what we call invisible scars on emotional and mental stress for children, for teachers, for their families. So what can we do about this? We would urge Congress to consider 3 areas to help close the gap. The first is an education recovery and what we call a return to learning. Congress must enact policies that, with a commitment that no child affected by a disaster misses more than a month of school post-disaster. This is something that globally we're trying to work toward, but in the United States, to have children miss multiple months of school related to disasters is not okay. It's not enough. And the commitment to the return to learning should include a policy framework that quickly assesses the number of children out of school and the amount of recovery support and learning support that children need to get back to normal. The second area is Congress should consider amending Stafford to include childcare as a critical service. Right now, schools, primary, secondary, and higher ed are included, but early learning and childcare is still not included as a critical service. So that would go a long way to support children. And then the last area is that Congress must adequately fund mental health recovery programs for survivors of natural disasters. We are seeing this in every single incident in the U.S., that it is a critical gap that is putting the children at risk and families at risk. So thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony on our work. Children might be only 25% of our nation, but they are 100% of our future. So thank you for your commitment to children.
And thank you for your commitment to children as well. I think that was it's very moving. I went through a lot of the shelters, you know, after Harvey hit, and it was very sad to see all these children in the shelters. And I will take a look at the amending the Stafford Act. I think that's a very good idea. It's a very good idea. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Clay, I'd like to kind of focus on sort of my backyard and yours. That's my state, your state that got, Sheila's state that got hit. And this is kind of the, thought we had an easel. I'm sorry, you got to hold that up. Oh, okay. But so this is a map that I've shown to the governor, and I've shown to actually the President of the United States when he came down, talking about how the flood actually happened. And Cypress Creek was supposed to be a levee system, but they never did that. It watersheded down to Barker Attucks, then controlled spillage into the neighborhoods downstream at 1:30 in the morning, which wasn't all that great, and then Buffalo Bayou, downtown Houston. So it seems to me, you know, prevention, since this has flooded 3 times in the last 2 years, doing some of these flood mitigation projects is going to be absolutely essential, which is why we passed the supplemental $90 billion supplemental bill to deal with some of these flood mitigation projects. And, you know, I think, again, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. And so, and I know the governor sees this the same way. You know, when we've discussed this project, he agreed with me that it would be the #1 priority in the state in terms of flood mitigation. Where is the governor on this? And I think you mentioned something about your first 3 projects have now been approved. Can you tell me what those are? And then what in your view will happen with, I think, both the refortification of Barker Attucks and also the 3rd reservoir?
Sure. Well, let me first say the governor completely agrees with you that in order to really rebuild after Harvey, you know, a large portion of what we're going to have to do are these major scale projects that, as you mentioned, 3 floods in the last 2 years, major floods in the last 2 years in Houston. They've actually had 26 since the year 2000 in Houston. So, and 9 federally declared disasters in Houston. So projects of this scale are going to happen. As for the announcements later today, they're from the Hazard Mitigation Fund, which is the money. It's about $1.1 billion that we get under the Stafford Act as sort of a, you know, add-on. And they will be helping fund a regional study in the Houston area for a watershed assessment to look at what we can do, particularly in sort of the Montgomery County, Northeast Houston area. It will be for home buyouts throughout the Harris County Flood Control District. And it will be to start the process, engineering and study for dredging of the San Jacinto River. As for the 3rd reservoir, obviously it is a huge priority for the governor. And it's our understanding that we're going to be able to get this off the ground by doing a study first, and then hopefully followed up with, because of your work and the appropriation, follow up with getting it built.
Right, and you know, we I think did our work in the Congress. We got $90 billion appropriated. Army Corps of Engineer You know, let me just close because I know it's getting late in the day, but I look forward to continuing to work with the governor and your office, sir, on making this a priority. And I think getting Army Corps moving faster than they normally do. We put language in the supplemental that requires them to expedite some of these projects. And we already had studies done on Barker Addicts, but a study's never been done on Cypress. So that makes it even more critical to try to move forward as expeditiously as possible so we can get it done, because the study takes a while, the construction takes time, and I don't think this West Harris County area can wait 10 years for this.
Yes, sir. And let me say we completely agree with getting the Army Corps to move faster than it normally does. The governor was here about 3 weeks ago and sat down with General Simonite and his team over there. And so we're going to continue to work with them to make sure that this project and all the other ones that are needed get done as quickly as possible.
Okay.
And we're committed to working with you and the Army Corps to make sure that happens.
Likewise. Chair recognizes Michelle Jackson-Lee.
Thank the chairman and the ranking member for, again, their leadership, and acknowledge the fact that, in particular, Mr. Clay, the Texas delegation worked extensively hard as a senior member on the Homeland Security Committee. It was the experience that I've gained from a series of hurricanes, those in our jurisdiction, but as well throughout the nation, that I hope help bring to bear the urgency. I introduced the first relief bill, which is for $174 billion. I was not far off. In fact, the governor supported the introduction, had 43 co-sponsors. I'm glad at where we are, but we're not finished. And frankly, I think the $174 billion is a closer mark than where we are. And I hope we will continue advocating for continued relief as we do so for others who are similarly situated, from Puerto Rico to the Virgin Islands to Florida and others. Disaster has to be a federal responsibility, working with our local leaders from the state to the cities and counties. I hope you agree with that.
Absolutely, yes, ma'am.
In the course of that, and I read your statement and noted, as the chairman made mention of the changing map, the fact that you have a map that so much rain fell that we had to update the color charts. And I remember looking at those charts in the command center where the mayor was, and then George R. Brown, and that's the one that you had. In fact, we couldn't discern the boundaries of Harris County or Houston or anywhere else. There were some places where we were just simply an ocean, and I think people had to be there to understand the catastrophic nature of it. So I raise this point as we are beginning to work, I guess it would be on the second half, which is long-term recovery. And what I'd like to have is the input of the governor on hopefully working with the chairman and ranking member. We all have ideas, but beginning to, mine is being written as we speak over the years of experience, and that is FEMA in the immediate rescue. I just want to put it in that term, rushing in, dealing with the immediate rescue, folk on the ground, coming in, shelters, and then long-term recovery, which is what I'm seeing in Northeast Houston, Kashmir Gardens, and a number of other pockets of my community. People are still suffering. What is your thought about that? That would be really on the second phase of where the governor is now. People are in hotels. They need housing. People's housing are still in bad condition. What do you think about structuring, along with some amendments in the Stafford Act? I realize that, but that there is a bifurcation so we know when we're in the federal long-term recovery period.
Well, we couldn't agree more that it's not going fast enough, and that's true in Houston and throughout the whole region. I think one of the things, and I'd have to see the details a little bit closer, but what Administrator Long said earlier about grants directly to the state, I think they has the potential to make things go more quickly, with one caveat, which is it would have to free the state up from all of the compliance issues under 2 CFR and some of the other Stafford Act requirements. And that sounds scary, but we got to, and you know this, Congresswoman, but we have ample laws and procurement and risk law to protect against fraud, waste, and abuse in state statute that we would still comply with. But right now, as it stands, as we go through this long-term recovery process. We're not only trying to comply with the local and state laws and regulations, but also the massive 2 CFR that governs FEMA's response.
Well, let me, as the announcements, as I heard, I'm sorry that my colleagues are in Washington as the governor is making an announcement, but we congratulate him. We worked very hard on the watershed study. I've had that submitted over the years, and very grateful that we got it in again, and that's what they're operating under. And of course, the buyout, I think there should be major announcements so that both inner city and rural areas and urban areas are aware of that potential through the local government. Let me quickly thank Save the Children. I work closely with you in your work, and the children are vital, and you work with me. You were at a big event that I had in Houston during the Christmas holidays when children were still suffering. To the gentleman from Florida, let me quickly ask, would a reordering, and I'll just ask these two questions, would a reordering of FEMA, so there is a part that is long-term recovery that they can deal with and move kind of quickly on the long-term recovery, be helpful to you? And to the legislator from Puerto Rico, I'm stunned about politicians and partisanship, because I know that congressional persons, Republicans and Democrats, came to Puerto Rico with the greatest sincerity. I'm planning on being there in the next couple of months, and didn't see any partisanship, just a cry for help. So if you can answer that. But to the gentleman from Florida, would that be helpful to you? And would it be helpful that when your constituents apply for FEMA and they get that 33.5, there is so much red tape that people are struggling and can't get it? Give them the 33.5 and let them provide documentation, because you're denying them on little problems of documentation. But would the long-term recovery be helpful to you if there was a process so that it could be a focus after we've done all the initial rescuing?
Yes, ma'am, of course. I think we saw something encouraging come out of the federal government in the last couple of years, and that's the National Disaster Recovery Framework. All of the same collaboration that we bring to the table in an actual response is now expected on the backside during a recovery operation. In our joint field office down in Orlando, Florida, we were thrilled to have a whole host of federal partners there at the table with us day one after the storm, looking to put together a long-term recovery strategy, looking across the federal government at grant programs, how we could leverage those programs in our communities to provide a more holistic approach to our recovery. It was the first time we ever implemented it in Florida. I think one of the first times in the country that it's been done. And we would continue to want to develop that process and our own state partnership with that process.
So the federal government helping you by continuing a long-term approach would be helpful to you?
Yes, sir. I mean, yes, ma'am.
And then last to the gentleman, we care about Puerto Rico as we do the Virgin Islands. I can't name one politician that might have come in and been grandstanding. We care, we cried, and we want to keep fighting with you. So who was being... I don't understand your point.
Well, my point is very simple. You know, this hearing is about lessons learned, and
right.
we have, you know, during all this issue of recovery effort of Irma and Maria, you know, we have the struggle on the local level and within the federal government, you know, with the issue of politics. You know, I know local politics, the Puerto Rico politics, are not entirely understood on the federal level, and they should not be part of this discussion. But it is important that, you know, we Puerto Ricans, you know, we're moved as a whole, as a people. You know, everyone was touched by this storm, and the fact that some of them at the local level and at the federal level actually try to gain, you know, political recognition using the pain and suffering of all people. You know, it's shameful. But I don't want to, you know, I'm not here to be naming names. I'm just trying to state that was one of the lessons that we learned down in Puerto Rico.
Well, I'll just conclude by saying everyone on this panel I know are here supporting you and wanting to work very hard to develop and to find solutions to Puerto Rico. And I just want to honestly say all of the federal members of Congress that I've encountered, I've never heard a cry of politics. I've heard a cry for help. And I want to encourage them because their cry for help is generating help for all of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Noticing how long we've been here and the time, I would just like to ask the four of you if you could submit to our committee recommendations that you have. Each of you experienced a different devastation, a different disaster, a different population of people you were trying to help. So it would be real helpful to us if you could tell us what worked, what didn't work, in a small, we don't need an elaborate report. But if you could just submit to us, if we have it in writing and your suggestions for us, that'd be very helpful for us to act and to help you prepare for and respond to the next disaster that you face. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remaining of my time, and I thank all of you.
Thank you.
And we thank you for yielding back the remaining of your time. Ms. Demings is recognized.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And yes, we have been here for a little while, but thank you so much for taking our questions. My question is for you, Mr. Mccaul. You know how important federal and state partnerships are to our response and trying to make sure that it's an adequate and appropriate response. As you know, Hurricane Irma had a tremendous impact on Florida, even on Central Florida, where I represent. Thousands, including medically vulnerable individuals, were without power for several days. Homes in the Ola Vista area, in the Orlando area, were flooded. And though many lost their possessions, they did survive, and we are certainly thankful for that. While you were not the director at the time of Hurricane Irma, it is my understanding that you did serve as the chief of staff, a position that did not exist prior to your service, I believe. And as a chief of staff, I am sure you are aware of the needlessly tragic events that resulted in more than a dozen deaths at the rehabilitation center in Hollywood Hills. As a Floridian who has weathered my share of hurricanes, I understand that the power goes out. Mine did as well, and it can take some time to be restored, and we do have to be reasonable and understanding in that area. But I also know that vulnerable populations like seniors and seriously ill or mobility-restricted individuals require accommodations that you or I would want, certainly if we were in their place. Yet it took, I believe, 3 days to evacuate 140 patients who, in Florida's September heat with no air condition, to move them right across the street to a hospital there. So my question for you, Mr. Mccaul, is now that you are the Emergency Management Director, what steps have you taken or are you taking to ensure that proper communications channels are in place to prevent tragedies like the one in Hollywood Hills?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Obviously, taking care of our vulnerable populations that are medically dependent is not only a priority of ours, but it's a priority of everybody in our state. First and foremost, as it relates to power restoration, that has been a huge focus. We know in Florida that if you get the power back on, most of your other problems goes away. The government can get out of the recovery business, and local communities can more quickly recover. So we've been making huge strides in that. Like I said before, we undertook the largest power restoration in American history. We got to about 100% restoration in less than a week. We've created strategic partnerships with Health and Human Services up here in DC. They've been able to provide us critical information of data they have on individuals who are dependent on medical equipment for, electric equipment for their medical needs, and we're able to do proactive call-outs to check in on those folks. We provide that information to our communities so that they can do proactive call-outs in the immediate aftermath to see if they need to be evacuated.
I'm sorry, could you go over the equipment again that you provided? What's the equipment?
Not providing equipment. It's a list of people that HHS has been able to provide us, of people who are dependent on electrical equipment for medical needs. We're able to find out in the immediate aftermath who those individuals are and do a proactive reach out to see, do you have power? Do we need to transport you somewhere that you have, so you have power for your medical supplies? Obviously, the investigation that's ongoing down in South Florida, I know that there is a criminal investigation going on, and I do believe that the local medical examiner has ruled those a homicide. However, the governor has taken some very aggressive steps to make sure that situations like this don't ever happen again.
And could you go over some, for examples of those steps, not just dealing with the investigation? I understand an ongoing investigation, but it could happen this hurricane season. So what steps have been taken to ensure that it doesn't?
We've required that all medical facilities have the ability to sustain power in the immediate aftermath, whether it be through generators, direct tap-ins to natural gas, so that for an extended period of time in the aftermath of a storm, they're able to support that capability. We're also working with on our sheltering plans to make sure that we have adequate special needs shelter space. A lot of what we saw in the aftermath of Irma was, or leading up to Irma, was that we had an inadequacy in planning at the local level as it related to the special needs planning. And so there were facilities that were literally putting people on transports and just dropping them off at special needs shelters, and that was their disaster plan. And so we're looking at reorganizing those, make sure that we have partnerships between facilities for the transport of those individuals. And then lastly, we're really working with our local communities to make sure they have a handle on what facilities are in their jurisdictions and how we can best support them.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
General Lay yields. But before I turn the gavel over to Sheriff Rutherford, I just want to thank all three of you for being here today and your service. Yeah, I thought I said all of you. Thanks to all of you for your service. And both in hurricane relief and also saving the children. That's God's work on earth. And just let me lastly conclude, I think a common thread that I heard between the three of you was a lot of red tape, needs to be better streamlined, maybe more control given back to the states. And I think that's what the Administrator Brock Long was talking about, and how to maybe block grant some of this to the states, give more flexibility, let things move faster, don't let it get bottlenecked up. So as we move forward on this committee, your input will be very important if we look at legislation to help make the response and recovery more efficient and effective. So with that, I yield, and I turn it over to Sheriff Rutherford. Yeah.
And that was perfect timing, because now I get to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Melendez, if I could ask you, I know on page 3 of your written comments talks about the need to make necessary adjustments to adapt our emergency preparedness and recovery efforts to more effective and efficient response. And number one on that list of what to do is actually to ensure rapid response by sea and air, including waiving or eliminating the cabotage laws, the Jones Act for ocean vessels. And so I wanted to point out that I believe somewhere between 75 and 80% of Puerto Rico's goods come through foreign vessels, and about 25% of Jones Act vessels, and that the President did in fact waive the Jones Act. And there was some controversy, and this might have been what you were referring to. There was some controversy about the President being slow in waiving the Jones Act and the impact that was having on recovery. And I'd like to point out that my calculations show that the President waived the Jones Act exactly 1 day later than he did for Harvey in Texas. And fact of the matter is, after waiving the Jones Act, exactly one foreign vessel sailed from an American port into Puerto Rico. And so for folks to point to the Jones Act and cabotage laws as somehow slowing down the response, I think number one is it's incorrect, as I believe you do as well. And number two, it's very very misleading in the fact that I take great pride in the fact that the American maritime industry, particularly our Jones Act vessels, under Tote and Crowley in Jacksonville are really, I looked at them as the first responders, the first maritime responders for Puerto Rico, because they have that, they call it the milk run. They do it so often. They have that built-in efficiency and effectiveness. And so they had actually pre-positioned goods at our port so that they could get them to San Juan more quickly. And in fact, that was accomplished in a very, very quick fashion. And so
Well, the only reason that it is on my statement, the reference to the capital shield, the Jones Act, is because of the controversy that, publicly arose in Puerto Rico about whether it was the right timing when the president actually gave the waiver. So that's why it is on the statement.
Okay, but I just want to make sure that you're not laying out a case that somehow the Jones Act slowed down.
No, not at all, not at all, not at all.
I just want to make that clear. Mr. Mccaul, we had discussed earlier, and I don't know if other states have this this issue, but I know in Florida, a lot of municipalities and other governmental agencies, we had these prearranged contracts with providers, contractors to take the debris out of our neighborhoods. And I just want to ask, what do you think we can do to make them honor those contracts when they leave those contracts that they made pre-storm at a much lower price, by the way, so that they can get the contract, and then once the storm hits, they go to other localities where they can make more money? And I would call on our Attorney General Pam Bondi to look at that, because to me that sounds like gouging maybe, and I know she is on top of that. So what do you think about that?
So you asked whether other states have experienced the same thing, and sir, the answer is yes. If you look at all of the recent congressional after-action reports that have come out of major storms over the past couple decades, all of them highlight debris contracting as a significant issue coming out of major storms. We saw significant differences in the negotiated pre-disaster cubic yardage price, some as low as like $5, whereas after disaster hits, negotiated prices go up, or renegotiated prices were going up to $20 a cubic yard. We also saw significant pressure being put on individuals to try and suggest that the Army Corps should take over the entire debris mission, some of which would have cost taxpayers 10 times as much, with no significant expediency, increased timeline, because of the fact that many of the same contractors were both in the pre-disaster contract business and working for the Army Corps. I'm very proud of the steps that our governor took to draw a line in the sand and to make sure that we weren't creating a bidding war in our state, and that we weren't going to stand for those types of practices happening to our citizens. Moving forward, I think we need to take a look at this as a profession. I think that until kind of states and communities stand together with our federal partners and say we're not just going to stand for this anymore, it's going to continue to happen. I think that we need to work on more education, and we are in Florida with our local partners about the risks of some of this and certain provisions and best practices for their contracts. I think we need to kind of crack open the books on the contracts we currently have and make sure that the expectations that have been set are actually going to be honored. And we need to be putting together, we're actually putting together in some of our rural counties teams of locals and contractors who are willing to do the work for that county themselves with internal capacity, which will help not only with a faster response to the debris cleanup, but also reinvest that money in local communities. And then lastly, I know the Attorney General is taking a look at it, but we ourselves are also working with communities to take a look at last year's actions and see whether or not we were dealing with any bad actors.
Very good. Thank you for that. And I have several other questions, but my time is up. I do want to congratulate you, though. I think Florida had a very good response. some areas, obviously, that we needed to look at, and these storms clearly highlighted that need. So, but thank you for working with us.
Thank you, sir.
I want to thank all the witnesses. My time is up, as I mentioned. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing if you don't mind. And pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing...
Mr. Chairman, here I am.
Oh, I'm sorry.
As a sit-in ranking member, I want to make sure that I have an opportunity to close for a moment before you gavel us out.
Sure.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank our chairman and ranking member for this, I think, very thoughtful and important hearing. We know, Representative, that Puerto Rico had warehouses where people were not there to process, and so we know that learning from all of you, we can be better prepared, and we can work together to save the children. Let me thank you again for coming under the new legislation, but more importantly, standing up for children, and certainly we saw you in the state of Texas, and I know that you were many in other places. As it relates to Florida and Congressman Rutherford's question, we thought the debris removers were leaving Texas to go to Florida, so we have to get our handle around how we, in simultaneous hurricanes, that we are able to address this question, because we were struggling and we were fearful that everyone would move in that direction, but you needed help. We all need help. Let me thank Mr. Clay, and please convey to the governor and state officials the appreciation for their eagerness and collaboration and constant contact. I know that my county judge, I'm mayor in Houston, and I know the mayors and county judges throughout the state were most appreciative. We were huddled together in many meetings. We were on tarmacs. We were in meetings in places that were uncomfortable, but we know that our people are still uncomfortable. So I just want to leave you with this. If the governor, we are grateful that we were able to send $89 or $90 billion that we have a large share of. We need to work with the governor to help to expedite a number of projects. Greens Bio is already being worked on, but I would like it expedited, and then we're working on certainly some other projects from halls to others. So if you can help us with that, and then if you would help us on the issue of working with FEMA for them to address the denials. Denials have been done on typos, and we have too many people in need. My last point is, I think we should convene a meeting shortly for the 2018 hurricane season. We may be lucky, all of us may be lucky, but I think the idea of members of Congress sitting in that meeting and representative local officials in that meeting would be very, very helpful, because as you well know, we're still proceeding with appropriations. What do we need to do? And how do we need to prepare our communities? We can't really predict the future. We can look at the models, but it's evidence, I guess the map is going, it's evidence that we saw something in 2017 that we had never seen before. So thank you to all of the witnesses in the first panel, second panel, and I think this is a wake-up call for us to get prepared as we go into 2018. And I thank you to the chairman, and I yield back. Thank you all very much. Please convey my appreciation to all of the local leaders.
Thank you, and I apologize for the oversight.
Not at all, Congressman.
If you would, Mr. Mccaul, also let Governor Rick Scott know that I'm very appreciative of the great job that he did at the state level, and I'm very proud of Florida's response, both state, local, and federal. Our National Guard did a fantastic job, our Coast Guard, so thank them as well.
We're really thanking everybody. So let me ditto the Coast Guard, the National Guard,
Yes.
and let me call out the county judge in Harris County and our Mayor Turner, who did a fantastic job.
Okay.
We all have to go home.
That's right. That's right.
But they did a fantastic job. Thank you
you
so very much, and the Coast Guard. They are our wings
Absolutely.
of angels. Thank you.
They are fantastic. And so under pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. And with that, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
You did that excellent. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Just to let him. Thank you. No, I appreciate your leadership on this. Thank you very, very much.
En algún lugar por ahí. My card.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
All right. I'm taking out of yours.
Okay. Terrific.
So, when you're back down there, feel free to call me.
Yeah, I'm going to be there all next week. We're working on our long-term recovery plan and how we're going to be partnering with the Department of Education, but also specifically with schools.